The Smuggler's Son by Tye Barter. Chapter 1. The November wind cut through the crowd gathered around the fresh grave, carrying with it the salt tang of Burgeo harbor and the promise of a hard winter. Dorman Keating stood between his mother Margaret and his friend Emily Parsons, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his only good coat. His father's coat, actually. It hung loose and long on his smaller, thin frame. But Mum hadn't the money for a new one, and he'd grown past caring about such things. Reverend McKinnon's voice drifted over the gravestones, his words about redemption and eternal rest lost in the wind. Dorman kept his eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross that marked Uncle Danny's resting place, trying not to think about the 50 tins of contraband rum hidden beneath the floorboards of the briny Rose, sitting silent in the harbor below. "He was a good man at Erd," whispered Mrs. Baggs, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Led astray, he was." Dorman bit back the words that wanted to come. He almost cracked a joke, but choked it back. Uncle Danny hadn't been led astray by anyone. He'd done the leading. It was Da who'd been dragged into his schemes, and now Da was paying the price in a prison cell in Porto Basque, while Uncle Danny lay peaceful under 6 feet of frozen Burgeo earth. Emily's gloved hand found his elbow, squeezing gently. She'd been his anchor these past days, understanding without words that some grief was too complicated for tears. When the service ended and the small crowd began to disperse, she walked with him and his mother back toward the harbor road. "You'll come by for supper tomorrow?" Emily asked quietly as they paused at the fork where the path led to the Parsons' 3-story house. "If Mum's feeling up to it," Dorman replied, glancing at Margaret. His mother had been coughing more lately, a deep, wet sound that worried him in the small hours when he lay listening to the wind rattle their windows. Margaret managed a weak smile. "Course we will, Emily. Thank your mudder for the invitation." After Emily had gone, Dorman helped his mother up the slope to their house, noting how she leaned more heavily on his arm than she had even a week ago. Her face was pale beneath her black hat, and when they reached the kitchen door, she paused to catch her breath. It was like in a matter of days she became elderly and weak. "I'll make the tea," Dorman said, guiding her to the chair by the stove. "You sit and warm yourself." Margaret didn't protest, which strangely seemed to worry him more than her coughing. She settled into the chair with a soft sigh, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Good lad," she murmured, watching as he busied himself with the kettle and tea caddy. The routine of making tea, measuring leaves, waiting for the water to boil, warming the pot, gave his hands something to do while his mind churned. 3 weeks since Da's arrest. 3 weeks of trying to fish alone, of mending nets by lamplight, of watching every penny and still coming up short. The briny Rose needed new planking in her stern, but the lumber would cost more than he'd earned in the past month, and now Mum was getting sick, just as the weather turned cold and the fishing grew scarce. "Dorm," Margaret said softly, accepting the cup he offered. "We needs to talk about tings." He sat across from her at the scarred wooden table, wrapping his hands around his own cup for warmth. "What is it, Mum?" "Da money situation." She sipped her tea, then set the cup down carefully. "I've been going over the accounts, and—" She trailed off, coughing again, that harsh, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. Dorman waited until the coughing subsided. "How bad is it?" "Oh, it's bad, Dorman. It's bad." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "We've got enough coal for maybe another week, food for less than that, and the Rose. She needs work before the winter storms come, or she won't be seaworthy come spring." The weight of it settled on Dorman's shoulders like a sodden net. 14 years old, and he was the man of the house now, responsible for keeping them fed and warm and alive until Da came home. If Da came home, that is, but that was a thought he pushed away before it could take root. "I'll go out again tomorrow," he said, "if the weather holds." "Dorm, love." Margaret reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "You've been out every day this past week. If the fish aren't there, they aren't going, get in the net, and that's not your fault." But it felt like his fault. Every empty net, every wasted day of fuel, every time he had to return to harbor with barely enough cod to fill a bucket. The other fishermen were struggling too, but they had years of experience, knowledge of secret spots and weather patterns that Dorman was still learning. His Da and Uncle Danny had always made it look easy, but Uncle Danny was gone, and Da was locked away, and there was only Dorman left to figure it out on his own. Maybe I could ask Edward to crew with me, he said. Extra pair of hands might help. Margaret nodded slowly. Eddie's a good lad. His fatter might be willing to let him go. His fatter is sick. He hasn't been working proper in a while. Cancer, I heard. Friggin' shame it is. Margaret sighed. Dat family always has a rough time of it. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the tick of the mantel clock and the whistle of wind through the chimney. Outside, the early darkness of November was settling over Burgeo like a cold blanket. Dorman thought about the 50 tins hidden in the Rose's secret compartment, enough contraband rum to feed his family for months, maybe years. His Uncle Danny would have called it insurance, but it felt more like temptation to Dorm. Mum, what if, he said carefully, what if there was another way to get money, something Da left behind? Margaret's eyes sharpened despite her fatigue. What kind of something? Dorman hesitated. Da had made him promise to keep the secret, but that was before Mum started coughing, before the coal bin grew empty, before the weight of their situation became clear. On the Rose, into Eden compartment, there's cargo. What? Dat rum? We still have that? With all that happened that fateful night at McAllister's stage and all that had happened since, Margaret somehow had allowed herself to completely forget about the tins on the briny Rose. Sudden realization dawned across her face, paling her sickly skin even more. 50 tins, dose ones Da put in the hidden hold. Dorman looked at his mum. No one knows about Dim. The owner that Da was running for was arrested. Constable Griggs thinks they all blew up that night at McAllister's stage. That was only half of the tins. Dorm finished. Margaret closed her eyes, her hand moving to her forehead. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. You're fatter. He left that poison on the boat. He didn't want to, Mum. But with Uncle Danny dead and Day arrested and the Mounties searching, he had to leave it. He paused. It's our burden now, Mum. We gots to do something with it. And now you're telling me? Her voice was loud enough that Dorman glanced toward the window, worried the neighbors might hear. That stuff could hang us all, Dorman, if the Mounties find it. They won't. The words came out more confident than he felt. Dose Mounties searched the boat twice after Daw's arrest. Found nodding, the compartment's too well hidden. Margaret stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back, her movements sharp with agitation. We have to get rid of it, dump it overboard, bury it onto sandbanks. I don't care where, but it can't stay on that boat. If does Mounties find 'em, not only will we get in trouble, but your Da will probably face more time too. But Mum, no. She turned to face him, and he saw steel in her eyes, the same steel that had kept their family together through rough years, through the lean seasons, through all the small disasters that life in Burgeo could dish out. I won't have my son turning into his uncle, won't have him breaking his father's art. Dorman felt something drop inside his chest. But we're starving, Mum. You're sick. The Rose is falling apart, and winter's coming. That rum could save us. At what cost? Margaret's voice was softer now, but no less firm. Your soul? Your freedom? You think your father would want you to follow his path? Down that same path as your uncle? Dorman stared at his hands, seeing calluses forming where the fishing lines had rubbed, dirt under his nails that wouldn't come clean no matter how hard he scrubbed. At 14, his hands already looked like a working man's. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending a puff of smoke back down the chimney. Margaret coughed again, harder this time, her whole body shaking with the effort. When it passed, she sank back into her chair, spent. We'll manage, she said quietly. Somehow we'll manage. We always do, me son. But looking at her pale face and hearing the wheeze in her breathing, Dorman wasn't sure they would. The coal bin was nearly empty, the food cupboard bare except for some hard biscuits and a tin of condensed milk. If the weather turned bad and he couldn't fish for a week, they'd have nothing. I'm going out to check the rows, he said, standing. Make sure it's properly secured for tonight. Margaret nodded, too tired to argue. Don't be long, and wrap up. It looks like rain. Outside, the harbor was pewter dark under a sky heavy with clouds. Dorman walked slowly toward the wharf, his mind astir with possibilities and problems. Billy Spencer had been asking questions around town, careful questions about who might have access to good liquor for his tavern customers. Word was he paid fair prices and asked no questions about where his suppliers got their stock. The briny Rose bobbed gently at her mooring, her mast creaking in the wind. Dorman climbed aboard and went through the motions of checking the lines and fenders, but his thoughts were elsewhere. 50 tins of premium rum, hidden where no one would ever find them. Enough money to fix the Rose, buy coal and food, maybe even get Mum fixed up proper with a doctor and medicine. But it would mean becoming what his father had tried so hard not to be. It would mean lying to Mum, betraying Daw's trust, walking down the same dark path that had led Uncle Danny to his grave. The first drops of rain began to fall as Dorman finished his inspection. He stood in the wheelhouse for a moment, listening to the patter on the roof and watching the lantern lights of Burgeo flicker through the gathering darkness. Somewhere in that warmth and light, Emily was helping her mother with supper. Billy Spencer was pulling pints and counting his profits. His neighbors were settling in for another quiet evening, secure in their routines. And below his feet, 50 tins of contraband rum waited in the darkness. A fortune in liquid temptation, a solution to all his problems, or perhaps the first step toward losing everything that mattered. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Dorman climbed back onto the wharf and headed home through the rain. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, carried by the coastal boat along with the usual cargo of mail, supplies, and gossip. Dorman recognized the official government seal before Margaret could hide it from him. He'd grown sharp-eyed about such things since Daw's arrest. The thick cream paper with its formal typeface looked foreign and threatening in their humble kitchen. "'Tis from the Department of Justice," Margaret said quietly, her voice already hoarse from the morning's coughing fit. She handed him the letter with shaking fingers. "You'd better read it. My eyes aren't what they used to be." Dorman unfolded the document carefully, scanning the formal language until he found the heart of it. His stomach dropped as the meaning became clear. "They're moving him," he said, the words heavy in his mouth, "to Dorchester Penitentiary in New Brunswick. Federal prison now." Margaret's face went white beneath the flush of fever that had been burning in her cheeks for days. "When?" "Next week." Dorman read on, his voice getting smaller. "Says here he's been reclassified as a federal offender due to the nature of his crimes, cross-border smuggling and such." He passed the letter back to his mother. The letter slipped from Margaret's fingers, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. Dorchester was hundreds of miles away. Might as well have been the moon for all the chance they'd have of visiting. Port aux Basques was hard enough to reach, but the mainland? New Brunswick? That would take money they didn't have, and time they couldn't spare. "He'll be so far away," Margaret's voice crackled, pressing her hand to her chest. Tears streaming now, she was no longer able to hold them in. "Oh, me son, what if something happens to us? How will he know?" Margaret dropped her head in a rare gesture of surrender and wept. Dorman picked up the letter from the floor, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. Another burden to carry, another problem without an easy solution. Dorman's hand slipped into his pocket, fingers finding the smooth mother-of-pearl handle of Uncle Danny's penknife. He traced the subtle contours, feeling the tiny imperfections that made it unique. The knife had become a talisman of sorts, something to ground him when everything else seemed to be slipping away. He clicked it open and closed once, the clean mechanical sound oddly reassuring in the quiet kitchen. Uncle Danny had always been so sure of himself, so confident in the face of trouble. Dorman wished he could channel some of that certainty now. "We'll be okay, Mum, I promise," Dorm whispered as he wrapped his arm around his broken mum. That night, Margaret's cough grew worse. She had Dorman move her bed downstairs, claiming it was better for her breathing to be near the stove and the eternal pot of water on top. What had been a troublesome wheeze became a harsh, racking sound that tore through their small house like a saw through green wood. Dorman lay in his narrow bed, listening to her struggle for breath in the room below, until he could stand it no longer. He found her sitting up in bed, her nightgown damp with sweat despite the November cold. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when she tried to speak, only a whisper emerged. "Mum, this is bad," he said, lighting the oil lamp with trembling hands. "I'm getting to doctor." She tried to protest, but the effort brought on another coughing fit that left her gasping and weak. Blood flecked her lips, just a few drops, but enough to send fear shooting through Dorman's chest like ice water. He threw on his coat and boots, then paused at the door. "I'll be back with Dr. Parsons. Just try to rest Mum. I'll be back with help." The night was bitter cold, with a wind that cut through his jacket and straight to his bones. Dorman ran through the empty streets and alleys of Burgeo, his boots slipping on patches of frost, his breath visible in white puffs. The Parsons' three-story house stood on the hill above the harbor, one light in a window still glowing warmly in the darkness. Dr. Parsons was known to leave that one light on all night long, a beacon to let all know the doctor's home. He hammered on the door until Dr. Parsons appeared, still in his nightclothes but alert despite the hour. The man took one look at Dorman's face and reached for his medical bag without a word and pulled on his overcoat and wool hat. "How long has she been like this?" Dr. Parsons asked as they hurried back through the night. "Coughing for over a week, but tonight's different. There's blood and she can barely breathe. She's in bad shape, doctor." The doctor's face showed little emotion in the lamplight. Softly, he said, "We'll have a look at her." Inside the house, Dr. Parsons examined Margaret with a gentle and respectful touch, listening to her chest, checking her pulse, asking quiet questions that she struggled to answer. Dorman hovered nearby, feeling useless and afraid. Finally, the doctor closed his bag and motioned for Dorman to follow him into the kitchen. Emily appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I heard Daddy leaving. I followed yous right away," she said softly. "Thought you might need someone." Dr. Parsons settled into a chair, his expression serious. "Your mudder has pneumonia, Dorman." "Advanced case. I can give her medicine to help with the coughing and the fever, but she needs rest, good food, and warmth. Most important, she needs to stay inside and keep dry." "Will she get better?" The question came out smaller than Dorman intended. "With proper care, yes. But it'll take time, weeks, maybe months. I'll leave you a little medicine for now, but you'll need more Darm, and it's not cheap. And if the infection spreads, she may need antibiotics or—" Dr. Parsons didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Emily moved to stand beside Dorman, her presence a small comfort in the lamplight. "We'll help," she said quietly. "My family, I mean. Mum can bring soup, and—" "No," Dorman interrupted, the word coming out sharper than he meant. "Thank you, Em, but I can manage. I'm the man of the house now." Dr. Parsons studied him with gentle eyes. "That's a heavy burden for a 14-year-old boy." "I'm not a boy anymore." Dorman looked the doctor straight in the eyes. "Them days are gone." The words felt strange in his mouth, but true. "My da's gone. My Uncle Danny's dead. Me mum's sick. There's only me left." The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavier than the stinking fish nets. He was the breadwinner now, the protector, the one who had to make the hard choices. Dr. Parsons left medicine and instructions, promising to check on Margaret the next day. Emily lingered a moment longer, her hand finding his in the darkness of the doorway. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered. Yes, I do. She's me mum. My da, put me in charge, he replied, though he squeezed her hand gratefully before letting go. After they left, Dorman sat beside his mother's bed, watching her labored breathing by the flickering light of the oil lamp. It was clear the medicine had eased her coughing. He observed her closely. She looked so small and fragile beneath the worn quilts. Her face was waxy pale except for the fevered flush on her cheeks. Her eyes closed, her mouth gaped open, struggling for each breath it seemed. Dorman whispered into her ear, I won't let anything happen to you. Whatever it takes, Mum. I'm the man around here now. I was gonna make some choices. You ain't gonna like Mum, but that's the way it's gotta be. No response came from his mother in deep slumber. He didn't know what to say anymore after that. He just sat and stared at her. His once strong mum, withered and weak. He couldn't even try to imagine losing her. He had to block that out. Dorman couldn't block the tears, however, not any longer. He couldn't hold them back. They flowed from him like never before. Days and weeks of pent-up emotion, of holding on and holding back. With no one to witness his moment of weakening, he simply surrendered. He gave in and collapsed completely. He cried. He cried for his mum. He cried for his Uncle Danny. He cried for his Da, his father, his hero. He cried and cried and cried until he could no more. He fell asleep on the hard, cold floor beside his mum that night without even noticing the discomfort. The next morning brought gray skies and a bitter wind that rattled the windows and sent spray across the harbor. Dorman forced himself through the routine of checking the briny rows, though his heart wasn't much into fishing that day. He stood in the boat's wheelhouse, listening to the creak of rigging and the slap of waves against her hull, thinking about the 50 tins hidden in her secret hold. By late afternoon, his mind was made up. Billy Spencer was polishing glasses behind the bar when Dorman pushed through the tavern's heavy door. The warmth enveloped him immediately, a thick blend of wood smoke and tobacco hanging in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of bodies and the sour tang of spilled beer. A few fishermen sat at corner tables, their voices low and their faces shadowed by lamplight. Darm! Billy looked up with surprise. Bit young for the tavern, aren't ye? I'm not here to drink, Dorman said just loud enough, approaching the bar with more confidence than he felt. I'm here about business. Billy's expression shifted, becoming more alert. What kind of business? Dorman glanced around the room, noting who was there and who might be listening. The fishermen seemed absorbed in their own conversations, and the nearest table was far enough away that careful words wouldn't carry. The kind you mentioned to Edward Kearley last week, Dorman said quietly, about being interested in quality spirits for your customers. Billy's hands stilled on the glass he was polishing. That's a dangerous conversation for a lad your age. I'm no lad, not anymore. Dorman met the older man's eyes steadily. I'm the man of the house now, and I've got something you might want. And what might that be? Premium rum, French Islands quality, unmarked tins. Billy set down the glass carefully, his movements deliberate. That's very interesting. How much are we talking about? 1 tin for now. To see how things go. Dorman had rehearsed this conversation in his head, trying to sound businesslike rather than desperate. So just a taste, eh? Of the merchandise. Billy nodded slowly. Smart approach. What's your price? This was the moment Dorman had been dreading, the negotiation, where his inexperience might show. What's it worth to you? Billy considered, his sharp eyes studying Dorman's face. French Islands rum, you say? Quality stuff. Da best, Dorm confirmed. Well, for the right buyer, that could be worth $40 or maybe a little more. But I'm just a tavern keeper with limited means. Billy leaned forward conspiratorially. I could do 25 for 110. Cash in hand. $25. More money than Dorman had seen at one time in months. Enough to buy coal and food, medicine for mum, maybe even lumber to patch the rows properly. Done, he said before he could change his mind. Billy nodded, seeming unsurprised by the quick agreement. When can you deliver? Tonight, if you want, after dark, Dorm replied. Clever lad. Billy resumed polishing the glass, but his voice remained low. Meet me at the back door around midnight. And Darm, this stays between us, right? Course. Dorman turned to leave, then paused. Billy, if things go well, would you be interested in more? Depends how good the shit is. If it's been watered down, it won't be worth more than a bucket of cod piss. If it's the real deal, Darm, well, it will sell itself. Billy continued. But yes, I might know people who'd pay a little more for the right merchandise. Billy's smile was knowing. Of course I'd get me cut from that finder's fee. You know, making the hookup. Billy leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Word is there's a new feller in St. Pierre. Sebastian Martel. Took over from his uncle after the arrests. Young, smart, looking to rebuild connections on this side of the water. He wiped a glass methodically. Quality merchandise, they say. Better than what we've been seeing lately. Dorman filed the name away, though he wasn't ready to think about new suppliers. The 50 tins hidden in the rows was his only concern. Still, it was good to know who the players were in this dangerous game. Play it smart, Darm. Start small. Build trust. That's how you do business that lasts. Repeat, business is mostly about relationships, not so much the product. You see, discretion with some folks goes a long way too, and most don't mind paying a little more for peace of mind. Outside the tavern, Dorman walked slowly back toward the harbor, his mind racing with plans and fears. The wind had picked up, sending whitecaps across the dark water and making the moored boats dance on their lines. He could see the briny rows among them, innocent looking in the lamplight from shore. $25. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a beginning. Food and medicine and warmth for another few weeks. Time for Mum to get stronger. Time to figure out what came next. And Billy had mentioned $40 for the right buyer. If Dorman was careful, if he was smart about it, those 50 tins could carry them through the winter and maybe even into spring. The thought should have brought relief, but instead he felt only a hollow dread in his stomach. Da had tried so hard to stay honest, to provide for them without compromising his principles. Uncle Danny had paid for his choices with his life. And now here was Dorman, barely 14 years old, about to step into the same dark waters that had claimed them both. But what other choice did he have? Mum was sick, Da was locked away in a prison hundreds of miles away, and winter was coming fast. The man of the house did what needed doing, even if it meant carrying secrets and telling lies and walking paths he'd rather avoid. Especially then, Dorman thought. Wasn't times like this that the man of the house was needed the most, when he had to step up and stand behind his decisions? The next morning brought a bitter clarity that cut through the fog of the previous night's decision. Dorman sat at his mother's bedside, watching her sleep fitfully. The medicine Dr. Parsons had left doing its work against the fever that had burned so fiercely just hours before. Her breathing was easier now, less of that terrible rasping sound that had torn at his heart. $25 sat folded in his pocket, crisp bills that Billy Spencer had counted out with practiced efficiency at midnight. No questions asked, no judgments passed. Just business, conducted in the shadows behind the tavern while Burgeo slept. Margaret stirred, her eyes opening to focus on his face. Dorm, you been sitting there all night. Just keepin' watch, he said softly, reaching to feel her forehead. Still warm, but not the furnace heat of the previous evening. How you feelin'? Much better. She struggled to sit up, and he helped arrange the pillows behind her. That medicine Dr. Parsons left. It helped with the coffin. Good. He hesitated, then pulled out some of the bills. I need to go get more medicine from him and pick up some supplies. Will you be all right for a bit? Margaret's eyes fixed on the money in his hand, her expression growing troubled. Dorman, where did that come from? Sold some gear we wasn't using, he said, the lie coming easier than he'd expected. Old nets and such. She studied his face with a sharp perception that came from 14 years of motherhood. What gear? We needs everything we've got. Just, just some extras. He folded the bills away quickly. I'll be back soon with your medicine. Dr. Parsons was in his surgery when Dorman arrived, preparing for his morning rounds. The older man looked up from his medical bag with a smile that faded when he saw Dorman's expression. "How is she this morning?" asked the doctor. "Better. The fever's down, and she's not coughing as much." Dorman pulled out $10. "I needs more of that medicine, and whatever else you think might help." Dr. Parsons accepted the money, his eyebrows raised slightly. "Where did you manage to find this, Dorm?" "Sold some fishing gear." The lie was becoming more polished with repetition. "Old Net's dad weren't any good for me anymore." "I see." Dr. Parsons moved to his medicine cabinet, selecting bottles and packets with careful deliberation. "These should last her an outer week. Make sure she takes the white powder twice daily with her tea and the brown liquid if the coughing gets bad again." "Yes, sir." "And Dorm?" The doctor's voice was gentle but firm. "If you ever needs help, I mean any kind of help at all, not just medical, you knows you can come to us, right? You don't have to carry this burden alone." Dorman nodded, though the words sat heavy in his chest. Help meant questions. Questions meant explanations, and explanations would lead to secrets he couldn't afford to share. From the doctor's surgery, he walked to Lake's General Store, the remaining $15 burning in his pocket. The morning was crisp and clear, with a bite in the air that promised winter's swift approach. Other villagers moved about their business, women carrying baskets, men heading to the docks, children scurrying to school with their lunch tins and scribblers. The brass bell above the shop door chimed as he entered, and Alistair Lake looked up from behind the counter where he was inventorying canned goods. His 12-year-old daughter Lucy sat on a stool at the counter, finishing a bowl of oatmeal. "Morning, Darm," Alistair Lake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man used to running things efficiently. "Learned your mum's been under the weather." "She's on the mend, thank you." Dorman approached the counter, acutely aware of Lucy's curious gaze. "I need some coal and groceries." "Course." Mr. Lake set down his clipboard. "What can I get for you?" 2 bags of coal, some flour, tea, condensed milk, salt pork." Dorman rattled off the list he'd been composing in his head, basic necessities that would keep them fed and warm for another week or two. "I'll be back with everything," he turned to Lucy. "Lucy, dear, you needs to get off to school before you gets in trouble with Mr. Fletcher." As Alistair gathered the items, Lucy slipped down from her stool and moved closer to Dorman. "How come you got money all of a sudden?" she asked quietly. "Mum was saying yesterday that your family was having a real hard time." "Sold some fishing gear," Dorman replied, the lie becoming as familiar as a well-worn coat. Lucy tilted her head, studying him with the same sharp perception he'd seen in her mother. "What gear?" "You was just complaining to Eddie about not having proper nets for winter fishing." Before Dorman could answer, Mr. Lake returned with his arms full of supplies. "That'll be $12 even," he said, setting everything on the counter. Dorman paid without haggling, though the amount would have made him wince just a day before. As Mr. Lake wrapped the purchases, Lucy continued watching with those knowing eyes that seemed far too mature for a 12-year-old. "Want me to help carry these?" she offered. "I can manage." He gathered the packages, noting how the coal bags made his shoulders ache. "Thank you, though." Outside the shop, Lucy caught up with him on the path, her boots clicking against the frost-hardened ground. "Darm, wait up." He turned, already dreading whatever questions she might have. Lucy Lake was too smart for her own good, always had been. Her father ran the most successful business in Burgeo by paying attention to details, and apparently that trait ran in the family. "You not going to school anymore, Darm?" she asked. "Well, kind of. Emily has been bringing homework for me." Dorm paused. "It's tough to bother with school when I's got so much to do, and Fletch is cutting me some slack." "You didn't sell any fishing gear," she said bluntly. Dorman felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Maybe you should mind your business. Or maybe you're lying." Lucy stepped closer, lowering her voice. Whatever you're up to, Darm, you needs to be more careful. People in dis town notices when someone who's been poor starts spending money they shouldn't have. I don't know what you mean. Course you do. Her expression was serious now, almost adult in its intensity. And if I can figure it out just by watching you for 5 minutes, then so can otters. People who might not be as friendly about it. A chill ran down Dorman's spine. What are you saying? I'm saying you needs to think before you act. If you really did come into some money, however you managed it, then you can't just start trowing it around. Not in a place like this, where everyone knows everyone else's business. She was right, and he knew it. In Burgeo, sudden prosperity was as noticeable as a bonfire on a dark night. People would start asking questions he couldn't answer, making connections eventually. Thank you for the warning, he said quietly. Lucy nodded, then surprised him by reaching out to squeeze his arm. I hopes your mother gets better soon. She's such a fine lady. And Darm, whatever you're doing, just be careful, all right? With that, Lucy turned and skipped off to school like the little girl she was. Dorm shook his head as he watched her prance off. The walk home felt longer than usual, weighted down by supplies and the growing realization that his problems were more complicated than he'd thought. It wasn't enough to simply have money. He needed to be smart about how he used it, how he explained it, how he protected the secret that could destroy everything if discovered. Margaret was sitting up in bed when he returned, looking stronger already. The medicine and rest were working their gradual magic, bringing color back to her cheeks and steadiness to her voice. You bought all this? She asked, watching him unload the supplies. We needed it. He avoided her eyes, busying himself with storing the food and stoking the stove with fresh coal. Can't have you getting sick again because we don't have proper fuel. Dorm. Her voice was gentle but firm. Sit with me. He reluctantly took the chair beside her bed, steeling himself for questions he didn't want to answer. I knows you're trying to protect me, she said, reaching for his hand, but I'm not a child and I'm not stupid. This much money don't come from selling old nets. For a moment he considered telling her everything, about Billy Spencer, about the rum, about the choices he'd already made, and the ones he was contemplating. But looking at her pale face and remembering the frightening sound of her coughing, he couldn't bring himself to add that burden to her recovery. I'm handling it, Mum, he said firmly. That's all you needs to know right now. I'm the man of the house, and I'm handling it. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then sighed. You're growing up too fast, Dorm. Sometimes I wishes... What? Nodding. She squeezed his hand. Just promise me you'll be careful. Whatever you're doing, whoever you're dealing with, promise me you'll think of your fatter and don't do anything that would break his heart. The words hit him like a belly punch. I promise, he said, though his words were hollow even as he spoke them. That afternoon, Emily appeared at their door with a basket of her mother's soup, her cheeks red from the cold wind. Dorman let her in gratefully, needing the distraction of her company and the comfort of her presence. Mum thought this might help, she said, setting the basket on the kitchen table, and I wanted to see how you both were doing. Much better, Emily, love, thank you, Margaret called from the other room. That medicine doctor, Parsons gave him, is working wonders. Emily smiled, but when she turned to Dorman, her expression grew serious. Can we talk? Outside? They walked down to the harbor in comfortable silence at first, their boots crunching on frost-covered grass. The afternoon light was golden but thin, carrying the promise of shorter days and longer nights to come. The briny Rose bobbed peacefully at her mooring, looking innocent among the other fishing boats. Lucy Lake came to see me today, Emily said suddenly. Dorman's stomach dropped. What about? About you. About money you shouldn't have. About lies you've been telling. Emily stopped walking and turned to face him. She's worried about you, Darm, and so am I. I don't know what... Don't... Emily held up her hand. Don't lie to me, too. I knows you better than anyone, Dorman Keating. I knows when you're happy, when you're scared, when you're pretending everything is fine. And right now you're scared and pretending and doing something you don't want to do. Dorman looked out across the water, watching gulls wheel and cry above the waves. Part of him wanted to tell her everything, to share the burden that was growing heavier with each passing hour. Your mother is sick, Emily continued. Your father is in prison. Your family has no money. And suddenly you're buying medicine and coal and groceries like money's no problem. She paused. It don't take a genius to figure out where dat money came from. Where do you think it come from? He asked quietly. From those tins your uncle and fatter left behind, the ones they thought nobody knew about. Emily's voice was matter of fact. I'm not stupid, Darm. I knows there was more. I could tell by the way you acted. Dorman felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Emily, it's just... How much is left? She asked. The direct question caught him off guard. What? How much rum do you still have? And don't tell me you don't know what I'm talking about. He stared at her, seeing a hardness in her eyes he'd never noticed before. This wasn't the gentle, book-smart girl who helped with church socials and school pageants. This was someone calculating, measuring, planning, maybe even conniving. And something else. Beauty. Beauty in those fierce, bright blue eyes that she stared at him through. Such an amazing contrast, Dorman observed, with her dark black hair. Enough, I suppose, he said, finally breaking from his trance. Enough for what? A week? A month? The whole winter? She asked. Maybe all winter, if I'm careful about it, Dorman replied. Emily nodded slowly. And you sold one to Billy Spencer last night. It wasn't a question, and he didn't bother denying it. How did you... Billy's been looking for a supplier for months. Someone reliable, someone quiet. Lucy mentioned you buying supplies this morning with cash money, and it wasn't hard to put things together. Emily moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You can't do this alone, Darm. You're already making mistakes, and we both know Griggs is no fool. What kind of mistakes? He asked. Spending too much too fast, paying full price for everything instead of negotiating, telling lies that don't make sense. Emily counted off on her fingers. In a week, half the town will be wondering where the Keating boy got his sudden windfall. The reality of what she said soaked into his bones like November drizzle. He'd been so focused on immediate needs, Mum's medicine, food, fuel, that he hadn't thought about the larger picture. But Emily had seen it all clearly, understood the dangers he was walking into. What do you suggest? He asked. First, you needs a better story. Selling old nets won't fool anyone for long. You needs to catch some fish, Darm. Even if it's just a little, it will make it easier moving to tens. Emily began pacing, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. Second, you needs to space out your sales. 1 tin every 2 weeks, maybe 3. What? Dorman's couldn't keep up with her. She stopped pacing and looked at him directly. And third, you needs a partner, someone who understands how this town works, who knows who to trust and who to avoid. You mean you, Dorm said. I mean me. Her chin lifted with determination. We're in this together now, Darm, whether you likes it or not. But Em, you're the doctor's daughter. And you're the smuggler's son. She snipped back with defiance clear in her expression. The idea should have horrified him, drawing Emily into the dangerous world he'd already entered, making her complicit in crimes that could destroy both their families. But looking at her keen eyes and seeing the quick intelligence that had already mapped out his mistakes and solutions, he felt something else entirely. He was glad to have her on his side. Emily certainly was in touch with everything going on. She spent much time gossiping with her father's patients. Not to mention her father's contacts, being a doctor, had him traveling all along the coastal communities around Burgeo. For a moment they stared at each other. Then Emily gave him one of her girlish smiles. Then she winked at him and said, Like I said, Darm, we're in this together. Dorman went awash with emotions, relief for one. For the first time since Da's arrest, he wouldn't have to carry this burden alone. It's dangerous, he warned. Everything worth doing is dangerous. Emily smiled, and for a moment she looked like the girl he'd known all his life. Bright, curious, fearless. Besides, I've got ideas about how to make this work better, safer. What kind of ideas? Dorm asked. Meet me tomorrow afternoon. Barter's Rock, I'll show you. She started back toward the village, then paused. Actually, Dorm? Never mind dat. I'll go fishing with you tomorrow instead. What? Emily, you've never... I'm quick at learning, and someone needs to keep an eye on you. Make sure you don't do anything else foolish. Her grin was mischievous. Besides, it'll give us a chance to talk about business without off to town listening in. That evening, Margaret took her medicine without complaint and ate a proper bowl of Mrs. Parsons' soup. The color was returning to her cheeks, and her breathing had lost that terrible labored quality that had frightened Dorm so badly. She was getting better, slowly but surely. As he sat by her bedside watching her sleep peacefully, Dorman felt a complex mixture of emotions stirring inside. Guilt over the choices he'd made, fear about the ones still to come, but also something else, a strange sense of partnership, of shared purpose, that had taken root during his conversation with Emily. She understood the game they were playing better than he did. She saw angles and possibilities he'd missed, and despite his attempts to protect her, she'd made her own choice to step into this dark water beside him. Dorm was pretty sure she didn't need too much protecting anyways. That girl could handle herself. Tomorrow they'd go out in the briny rows together, officially to fish, but really to plan, to figure out how two teenagers could navigate the dangerous currents of illicit contraband and smuggling without destroying everything they cared about. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending spray across the harbor. But inside their small house, warmth was returning along with hope. Mum was healing, the coal bin was full, and food filled their cupboards for the first time in weeks. The cost was his innocence and perhaps his soul. But as he listened to his mother's easy breathing and thought about Emily's sharp smile, Dorman found he could live with that trade. For now. Chapter 2. The morning brought snow as promised, not the fierce blizzard that would howl in from the Atlantic later in the season, but a gentle dusting that transformed Burgeo into a world of white silence. Dorman rose before dawn, his breath visible in puffs as he moved quietly through the cold house, careful not to wake Margaret. The floorboards protested under his feet with familiar groans as he built up the fire in the wood stove and set the kettle on for tea. Outside, frost had painted intricate patterns across the windows, delicate ferns and spirals that caught the pale morning light. Through the glass, the harbor stretched gray and restless beneath a sky like tarnished pewter. The briny rose waited at her mooring, a dark silhouette against the pale water. Looking at her now, Dorman felt the weight of ownership settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. This was no longer his father's boat that he was privileged to work. It was his responsibility, for better or worse, for the next 2 years. He packed a simple lunch of bread and salt cod into his father's old canvas bag, then pulled on his heaviest sweater and oilskin jacket. The cold bit at his exposed skin as he stepped outside, but the air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of fair fishing weather despite the snow. "Figured you could use some company," came a familiar voice from the path below. Emily Parsons stood there, bundled in a heavy wool coat with her red scarf wound around her neck and lower face. She carried a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth, steam rising faintly from beneath the covering. Her cheeks were pink from the cold and snowflakes caught in her dark hair like tiny stars. "You don't have to do this," Dorman said, though relief flooded through him at the sight of her. "I knows. That's what makes it choice rather than duty." She picked her way carefully down the icy path, her boots scuffing through the fresh snow. Mum sent tea and fresh biscuits, said fishing on an empty stomach is asking for trouble. Dorman found himself grinning. "Your mutter sounds like mine. All mutters are the same about food, I think." Emily reached the dock and looked up at the briny rose with undisguised curiosity. So this is the famous Briny Rose. She's smaller than I imagined from all your stories. A flare of defensiveness rose in Dorman's chest. She's perfectly sized for inshore work. Any bigger and she'd be hard to handle with a small crew. I didn't mean it as criticism, Emily said quickly, noting his tone. Her blue eyes were serious as she looked at him. Just observing. What do we do first? The transition from you to we didn't escape his notice, but Dorman decided not to challenge it. If Emily Parsons wanted to help, who was he to refuse? Especially when they both understood what was really at stake beyond simple fishing. Engine needs starting, he said, leading her aboard. Been giving me grief lately. Electrical system's near shot. The engine, temperamental on the best of days, fought his efforts to bring it to life. Dorman worked through the familiar sequence of troubleshooting, checking fuel lines, cleaning connections, adjusting the choke. When he finally located a loose wire in the electrical housing, Emily was already there beside him, holding a lamp steady without being asked. That should do it, he muttered, twisting the wire tight with cold, stiffened fingers. As Emily leaned closer to provide better light, Dorman became suddenly acutely aware of her presence. The faint scent of soap and something uniquely her, the way wisps of dark hair had escaped her woolen cap to frame her face, the unexpected steadiness of her hands as she adjusted the lamp's position without him asking. When she shifted to get a better angle, her shoulder brushed against his, and the brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through his entire body, leaving him with a peculiar tingling in his pants that made him suddenly self-conscious. The observation caught him off guard, and he fumbled the wrench he was using. You all right, Darm? She asked, genuine concern in her voice, as she caught his arm to steady him. Fine, he muttered, heat rising in his cheeks despite the cold. Just fingers gone numb is all. Her touch lingered for a moment longer than necessary before she released him. Maybe we should get you some warmer gloves, she said softly, and something in her tone made him look up to meet her eyes. For just a heartbeat, they stared at each other in the dim light of the engine compartment, close enough that he could see the individual snowflakes still melting on her eyelashes. He turned his attention back to the engine before he could do something else foolish. He managed a temporary fix that coaxed the old engine into reluctant life. Sputtering and coughing like an old man with chest congestion, the Rose was running rough, but it was running. That doesn't sound healthy, Emily observed, handing him a steaming mug of tea from her basket. Their fingers brushed as he accepted it, and this time the contact felt deliberate. It's not, Dorman admitted, wrapping his hands around the warmth gratefully. Needs new wiring throughout, but that's expensive work. Emily nodded thoughtfully, but didn't offer platitudes about things getting better. He appreciated that about her. She understood that some problems couldn't be solved with optimism alone. As Dorman guided the Briny Rose away from her mooring, he noticed several figures watching from shore. Constable Griggs was among them, his uniform dark against the snow. The Mountie raised a hand in what might have been greeting or warning. Beside him stood Billy Spencer, who waved more definitely, his breath visible in the cold air. Billy Spencer seems mighty interested in your family lately, Emily observed, following his gaze with sharp eyes. He and Da go back. I guess it goes back furder dan dat, Dorman replied, keeping his voice neutral as he navigated toward the harbor mouth. His grandfather and my mum's father were business partners. His family and my family are old friends, long before him and I come about. I trust him, almost like family. Aye, Emily said quietly. I see. The way she said it made him wonder exactly what she'd been thinking. Emily Parsons had always been clever, too clever sometimes for her own good or anyone else's comfort. Once clear of the harbor, Dorman set course for the fishing grounds his father had favored, a sheltered stretch along the coast where cod still gathered, despite their growing scarcity elsewhere. The familiar routine of preparing lines and baiting hooks provided comfort, a rhythm learned over years of working alongside Jack. To his surprise, Emily proved a quick study. Her small hands were deft with the bait, and she didn't complain about the cold or the smell of fish guts. She asked intelligent questions about technique, and listened carefully to his explanations. Her attention focused entirely on learning rather than merely helping. Holding up a baited hook, "Like this?" Emily asked. "Perfect," Dorman said, and meant it. "You're a natural." Emily flushed with pleasure at the praise, a smile transforming her face. "Me grandfather always said I had good hands for detailed work." They worked mostly in comfortable silence after that, occasionally exchanging observations about the weather or their position. The snow had stopped, and thin sunlight filtered through the clouds, turning the water silver. Emily seemed content with the quiet companionship, and Dorman found himself stealing glances at her as she concentrated on her line. The way she bit her lower lip when thinking, the determined set of her shoulders, the surprising grace with which she'd adapted to the boat's motion. By midday, they'd landed several good-sized cod. Not the greatest haul by any means, but much better than Dorm was doing on his own. Emily produced thick sandwiches from her basket, and they ate quickly, eager to return to fishing while daylight lasted. "Daddy says your daw's being transferred to Dorchester," Emily said as they worked, breaking their unspoken agreement to avoid difficult topics. "That's on the mainland, isn't it?" "Aye," Dorman confirmed, keeping his eyes on his line. "New Brunswick. Hundreds of miles from here. That's a long journey to visit. Too long and too expensive." The words came out harder than he intended. Emily was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm sorry, Dorm. It's not right what's happening to your family." The simple statement, delivered without falsehood, touched him deeply. She didn't try to tell him things would work out or that his father would be home soon. She just acknowledged the unfairness of it all, from his point of view. "No," he agreed quietly. "It's not right, but it's what we gots to deal with." Emily nodded, understanding in her silence. She'd shifted closer to him while they talked, close enough that he could smell the wool of her coat and see the fine texture of her skin where the cold had brought color to her cheeks. "We'll manage," she said firmly, "all of us, whatever it takes." The certainty in her voice, the way she included herself in his struggles without hesitation, made something warm unfurl in his chest. For weeks now, he'd felt completely alone with the weight of his family's survival. Having Emily share that burden, a partner, felt like a gift he didn't deserve. As the late afternoon deepened toward evening and snow began falling more heavily, Dorman reluctantly pulled in the trot lines they had run and turned the Brenny Rose back toward Burgeo. The wind was strengthening from the northeast, and his fingers had gone numb, his gloves stiff and frozen. He wanted to be ashore before full dark. The engine chose that moment to splutter, cough, then die. "No, no, no," Dorman muttered, rushing to the small engine compartment. The temporary repair hadn't held. It was the same issue in another location, harder to reach. With basic tools and failing light, he tried to replicate the morning's fix, but his cold, stiffened fingers made precision work nearly impossible. "What can I do?" Emily appeared at his side without panic or useless questions. "Hold the lamp steady," he instructed, grateful for her calm demeanor. After 20 minutes of increasingly desperate efforts, Dorman faced the truth. The briny Rose was dead in the water, with darkness approaching and a storm building. 13 miles from Burgeo was too far to row in these conditions, even if he'd had a dinghy aboard. "We're stuck, aren't we?" Emily asked, her voice remarkably steady. "Yes, for tonight, I tinks," Dorman confirmed, surprised by her composure. Most girls her age would be in tears by now. "Unless someone comes along," he added. "Not likely today, not in this weather." Dorman assessed the electrical problem. He just couldn't figure it out. Not in these conditions. "I'll try again in the morning, when there's proper light and the water's calmer. This storm is really taken off." Instead of fear or tears, Emily nodded practically. "Well, Den, we'd better prepare. What needs doing?" With repairs off the list for now, Dorman switched to emergency procedures his father had drilled into him. He secured the anchor, lit the navigation lanterns, and went below to the tiny cabin where Jack stored emergency supplies. His father had always been meticulous about safety. The cabin contained wool blankets, tinned food, fresh water, and storm lamps. The cabin was cramped, barely large enough for two people to move around comfortably. As Emily accepted a blanket with thanks, she had to duck through the doorway, and the movement brought her close enough that Dorman caught her subtle scent again, clean and warm despite their cold day on the water. "People will notice we're missing," Emily said, settling onto one of the narrow bunks. "Our parents will realize something's wrong when we don't get back tonight." Dorman nodded, though he worried privately. The storm would make spotting their small lights difficult, and even if they were seen, little could be done until morning. "We should take turns keeping watch," he suggested. 2 hours each through tonight. "Makes sense. I'll take first shift if you like. You've been working harder than me today," Emily said. As darkness fell complete, Dorman wrapped himself in blankets near the small cabin stove, feeding it precious scraps of wood for minimal heat. The briny Rose rocked uncomfortably in the increasing swells, and wind found every gap in the cabin's weathered planking. Emily sat by the small porthole, occasionally wiping condensation to check their surroundings. She seemed remarkably at ease for someone trapped on a disabled boat in deteriorating weather, her profile serene in the stove's flickering light. "You're handling this better than I expected," Dorman observed. Emily turned from the window, her face dimly lit by the stove's glow. "You forget that me grandfather was a sea captain. I grew up on his stories of being caught in storms far worse than this." Her smile was warm despite the cold cabin. "Besides, being stranded on a boat with you is better than attending Mr. Fletcher's Canadian history class." Dorman laughed despite their situation. "Old Fletch would say we're missing a valuable educational opportunity." "Oh, I think we can get quite an education here on this boat," Emily replied with seriousness. "Just not one he'd approve of." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. In the dim, wavering light, she seemed older somehow, not just the 14-year-old girl he'd come to know, or the girl he'd known all his life, but someone growing into something new. The realization was both thrilling and unsettling. As the night deepened, Dorman's thoughts drifted to simpler times, childhood afternoons climbing Barter's Rock with Emily, pretending to be lookouts for pirate ships or foreign invaders. The flat-top boulder provided the best view in town, and from there they could track boats for miles on clear days. "Remember when we used to play lookout on Barter's Rock?" Dorman asked, unable to sleep. Emily's profile nodded, soft in the amber light. "We'd spend ours up there in summer. You always insisted on being the captain, never the first mate." "I was older," Dorman defended weakly. "Yeah, by 6 days," Emily corrected, though her tone was affectionate. "And you were definitely bossier. Remember when we spotted that strange boat with the red sails and were convinced it was full of pirates? And we ran all the way to the arbor to warn everyone," Dorman laughed, the memory vivid. "Turned out to be old Tom Vardy testing an experimental sail design." "We made quite the pair of fools," Emily said, joining his laughter. "But it was fun, wasn't it? Before everything got so complicated," Dorman supplied when she trailed off. "Aye, complicated." Emily turned back to the porthole, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Sometimes I miss being that innocent, when the biggest worry was whether we'd see real pirates." "Me too," Dorman admitted quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind howl around the cabin and the waves slap against the hull. The intimacy of the small space, of being alone together in the storm, felt both natural and charged with new possibilities. Emily settled onto the bunk opposite Dorman. She could see he was awake. The storm had intensified, and sleep seemed impossible with the boat pitching violently in the swells. Dorman pulled Uncle Danny's penknife from his pocket, the mother-of-pearl handle catching the dim lamplight. His thumb traced the inscription on the brass bolster, "Saint-Pierre et Miquelon," a reminder of the French islands that had both blessed and cursed his family. When he was nervous, the knife seemed to find its way into his hands of its own accord. He flicked it open, tested the edge with his thumb, then began methodically sharpening it against the small whetstone he kept in his tackle box. The repetitive motion was soothing, something he could control when the sea and storm remained beyond his power. "That's a beautiful knife," Emily observed, watching his practice movements. "Uncle Danny gave it to me," Dorman replied, his voice soft with memory. "Last gift before, you know." Emily nodded, understanding the weight those simple words carried. "He'd be proud of how you're handling things," she said. Dorman said nothing, just continued the rhythmic scrape of steel against stone, letting the familiar action calm his racing thoughts as the storm raged outside. "Maybe we should talk about what happens next," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "With the rum, I means." Dorman had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was inevitable. Emily had made herself his partner, whether he wanted one or not, and she was too clever to be kept in the dark about the realities of what they were facing. "I've been tinking about it," he admitted. "Billy Spencer wants more, but selling one tin at a time is risky. Every transaction is another chance to get caught." "Exactly," Emily nodded, leaning forward with the intensity that appeared whenever she was working through a problem. "You needs to think bigger. Find someone who'll buy in bulk, 5 or 10 tins at once. Fewer transactions means fewer opportunities for something to go wrong." "But who? Billy's the only one I knows who deals in this sort of thing." Emily was quiet for a moment, staring into the stove's glowing embers. When she spoke again, her voice carried a calculating edge that reminded Dorman she was Dr. Parsons' daughter, raised around adult conversations about business and community affairs. "What about the fishermen from away?" Emily asked. "Those ones who come down from Corner Brook area or even to mainland during cod season. They'd have connections we don't, and they'd be gone before anyone could ask questions." Dorman considered this. It made sense. Traveling fishermen would have networks in larger communities where quality rum commanded better prices. They'd also be naturally discreet, since they had their own reasons to avoid official attention. "And you needs to stop tinking like a fisherman," Emily continued, warning to her theme. "Start tinking like a businessman. Set regular prices, establish reputation for quality, maybe even consider expanding beyond just rum." "Expanding?" Dorman's voice cracked slightly on the word. "Cigarettes, silk stockings, perfume, all the things women in outports can't get easy but would pay good money for. You've got the perfect cover with the fishing boat, and you knows these waters as well as anyone." The scope of what she was suggesting made Dorman's head spin. Emily was talking about transforming his desperate attempt to survive the winter into something approaching a real smuggling operation, the kind of thing that could support his family long-term, or land him in Dorchester beside his father. "Emily, you know what you're saying," he said carefully. "You're talking about serious criminal activity, not just selling a tin here and there to get by." Her blue eyes met his steadily across the cabin. "I'm talking about survival, Darm, and maybe about building something that could change both our futures." "I think the snow's letting up," Emily said eventually. "You should rest while you can. I'll wake you in 2 hours." Despite his doubts about sleeping with the boat pitching and wind howling, exhaustion claimed him quickly. The warmth from the small stove, combined with emotional fatigue from the day's events, pulled him into deep sleep. When he woke, it wasn't to Emily's gentle shaking, but to unfamiliar warmth pressed against his side. Disoriented, he blinked in the dim light of the dying stove, and gradually became aware that Emily had crawled under his blankets, nestled against him, with her head pillowed on his shoulder and one arm draped across his chest. Her breathing was deep and even, her body a welcome warmth against the bitter cabin air. Dorman froze, suddenly, painfully awake. He could feel every point where their bodies touched. He could feel her right through their clothes, her hip against his side, her hand resting just over his heart, the soft pressure of her cheek against his shoulder and her breast squashed into him. The intimacy sent heat and arousal through him, followed immediately by confusion and embarrassment. This was Emily, his childhood friend, the doctor's daughter, someone he'd known all his life. Not someone he should be thinking about, not that way. Yet the warmth of her pressed against him, The unexpected softness of her body through their clothing botched any attempts at proper thoughts. She smelled like wool and sea salt, and something uniquely her own, clean and sweet. Her hair tickled his chin where some strands had escaped its pins, silky strands that Dorman breathed right into his nostrils. He savored the scent, the feeling. While he debated whether to move away, Emily stirred, murmuring something inaudible in her sleep and pressing her body even closer. Her movement made it clear that his body was reacting in ways that he could not help. He felt his ears and cheeks heating up. Was he embarrassed? He couldn't tell, but he most certainly would be if she woke up and seen him like this. He shifted slightly, adjusting himself a little, trying to create space without waking her. But the motion only caused her to tighten her grip, her hand curling into the fabric of his sweater. A sudden lurch of the boat as a large wave hit jostled them both. Emily's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to awareness as she registered where she was, her face mere inches from his in the dim light from the emergency lanterns. "Oh!" she gasped softly, pulling back slightly but not entirely away. Color flooded her cheeks. I got so cold sit and watch. The stove went out and I couldn't get it relit. I didn't mean to fall asleep like this." "It's all right," Dorman managed, his voice strange to his own ears. "Smart thing to do. Share body eat when you're cold." They stared at each other in the dim light, neither moving to increase the distance between them. Dorman was suddenly intensely aware of how blue her eyes were. Brighter it seemed in the dim cabin light, deeper blue than summer sky over Burgeo. Her lips were slightly parted, and he found himself wondering what it would feel like to... The thought shocked him into stillness. This was Emily, his friend, the girl who'd helped him catch hermit crabs in tide pools and shared her lunch when he'd forgotten his own. Yet looking at her now, sleep-tousled and warm against him, she seemed like someone entirely new, and she was driving him nuts. "I should probably get up," Emily whispered, though she didn't move. Her voice was soft, uncertain. "Must be your turn to watch by now." "Probably," Dorman agreed, equally motionless, caught in a moment suspended outside normal time. Her hand was still pressed against his chest, only now it was ever so gently massaging his chest muscle, and he was certain she could feel how hard his heart was beating. There was no hiding that. Emily's gaze dropped to his lips, then back to his eyes. "Darm," she began, a whisper barely audible. Another violent roll of the boat broke the spell. Emily sat up quickly, straightening her rumpled clothes and not quite meeting his eyes. "I'll see if I can get the stove going again," she said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and moving across the cabin quickly. Dorman sat up more slowly, grateful for the dim light that hid his flushed face and other physical reactions. He busied himself folding their shared blankets, needing something to occupy his hands and to cover himself while trying to tame down his feelings, trying not to notice the lingering scent of Emily's hair, trying to forget the memory of her soft weight against him. "I think the storm's passin'," he noted, desperate to restore normalcy. "If we're lucky, morning will bring calmer seas." "That would be good," Emily replied, her voice carefully neutral as she coaxed sparks from the cold stove. "We'll need settled weather if you're going to fix the engine properly." The practical discussion helped bridge the awkward moment, allowing them to ease back into companionable routine. They managed to start a small fire with the last of their kindling, though it provided more psychological comfort than actual heat. As they settled into the night's second half, Dorman took the watch position by the porthole, deliberately maintaining distance. Yet even as he stared out at the dark waters, his mind kept returning to the feeling of Emily nestled against him, a sensation his body seemed determined to remember, despite his best efforts to focus on their predicament. Outside, the storm was indeed passing, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and the deep quiet that follows violence. By morning, they would likely be rescued or maybe manage repairs themselves. It was clear something fundamental had shifted between them in the darkness that night, something neither Dorm nor Emily quite understood yet, still shielded by a sliver of innocence. Both would remember this night long after the briny rose carried them safely home. When Emily finally relieved him for the final watch, their fingers touched briefly as she took the lamp. Neither pulled away immediately, both actually lingered a little, and in that small contact lay the promise of questions they weren't quite ready to ask, much less answer. Dawn broke gray and uncertain. The storm's fury spent leaving behind a world of intermittent gusts of wind and wave. Dorman worked at the engine with numb fingers, while Emily held the lamp steady, both of them exhausted from their sleepless night, but determined to get the briny rose running before search parties risked themselves in the aftermath. "Try it now," Dorman called, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught with a reluctant rumble that sounded like an old man clearing his throat. It wasn't pretty, but it would get them home. "Thank God," Emily breathed, her relief evident. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hair had escaped its pins completely during the night, giving her a wild, windswept look that made Dorman's chest flutter with something he didn't dare think about at that point. Dorman was quick to weigh anchor and limped toward Burgeo as the sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered coastline in shades of gold and pink. The briny rose coughed and wheezed with every wave, but she held together, carrying them slowly home through waters still choppy from the storm's passage. As they rounded the harbor entrance, Dorman spotted figures gathering on the wharf. More people than usual for this early hour. Word of their absence had clearly spread through town during the night. "Looks like we worried some folks," Emily observed, waving both her arms toward shore, where several familiar faces were visible. Dr. Parsons stood at the dock's edge, his medical bag in hand and his usually composed face tight with concern. Beside him, Margaret Keating leaned heavily on Alistair Lake's arm, her face pale but determined. Even Constable Griggs was there, though his presence carried the weight of official duty rather than personal worry. "There they are," someone called as the briny rose puttered into the harbor. "Safe and sound." Relief rippled through the gathered crowd like wind through wheat. Dorman could see tears on his mother's face as she watched them approach, and guilt twisted in his stomach. He'd put her through a night of terror when she was already struggling with illness and worry about his father. Billy Spencer jogged down the wharf as Dorman secured the mooring lines, his usual easy grin replaced by genuine concern. "Jesus, Darm, we had boats out looking for ye until the storm got too rough. Your poor mudder's been pacing to floors all night." "Friggin' engine died on us," Dorman explained simply, as Billy took Emily's hand as she climbed onto the dock. Dorman followed. "Managed to fix it this morning. I needs to get a working radio back on the Rose." Emily moved with careful dignity despite her exhaustion and disheveled appearance. Her father immediately enveloped her in an embrace that spoke of a night spent imagining the worst. "Don't ever frighten me like that again," Dr. Parsons murmured into his daughter's hair. "When you didn't come home last night." "We were safe, Daddy. Darm kept us safe," Emily assured him, though Dorman noticed she didn't meet his eyes, perhaps remembering the intimacy of their shared warmth in the cabin's darkness. Margaret reached them then, pulling Dorman against her with fierce strength despite her recent illness. "I thought I'd lost you too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't bear it, Dorman. I couldn't bear losing you too." The raw pain in her voice cut deeper than any reprimand could have. Dorman held his mother tightly, breathing in her familiar scent of soap and worry. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have checked the engine more careful before we left." "You're home now," Margaret said, pulling back to study his face with the intensity only mothers possessed. "That's what matters. But next time—" "I'll be more careful," Dorman promised. "Much more careful." Constable Griggs approached as the crowd began to disperse, his expression unreadable. "Glad to see you both safe. Rough night to be stranded on the water." "Rough enough," Dorman agreed, wondering if the Mountie was fishing for information or simply making conversation. "Engine trouble, you said? The old boat is starting to show its years." "She's getting old," Dorman agreed. "Sometimes old things break down when you needs them most." Griggs nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving between Dorman and Emily, with the professional assessment of a man trained to notice details. "Well, as long as everyone's safe." That's what counts. But as the constable walked away, Dorman caught the backward glance he threw toward the briny rose, and a chill prickled down his spine. 3 days later, Emily cornered Dorman at the harbor as he performed routine maintenance on the briny rose. The close call with the storm had reminded him how precarious his situation was, alone on the water with no backup if something went wrong. You needs a crew, Emily said immediately, settling beside him on the dock with her slender legs dangling over the edge of the dock. What happened our other night proved it. You can't keep going out by yourself. Can't afford crew wages, Dorman pointed out, not looking up from the net he was mending. Barely covering expenses as it is. I'm not talking about wages. I'm talking about partnership. Emily's voice carried the calculating tone he was learning to recognize. Edward Kearley, for instance. His family needs money desperate. He's strong as an ox and he has experience fishing. Dorman's hand stilled on the net. Edward, what makes you think he'd be interested? Because his father's dying, they already sold their boat, and I heard they is about to lose their house, Emily replied bluntly. Cancer. Daddy says maybe 2 months left, if that. Edward's been picking up odd jobs wherever he can find them, but it's not enough. The news hit Dorman like cold water. He'd known Eddie Kearley since childhood, a quiet, serious boy a few years older who'd always been built like a stone wall despite his youth. He was built like a brick shithouse, Uncle Danny used to say. Edward's father, Lawrence Kearley, had been a steady fisherman and decent man who'd never caused trouble for anyone. They lived the area known as Muddy Hole. Edward lived there with his dying father, his mother Janice, and his baby sister Jessie. I didn't know, exactly, Dorman said quietly. About his fatter, I means. I knew he was sick. Not many do. The family's keeping it quiet, but they're desperate. Emily leaned closer, lowering her voice. Edward would be loyal, Darm, and he'd keep secrets if he had reason to. His family needs what you could offer. Regular income, no questions asked. The logic was there, even if the implications made Dorman's stomach churn. Recruiting Edward would mean expanding his reluctant criminal enterprise, drawing another person into the web of risk and secrecy. Yet Emily was right about needing help, and if Edward's family was truly desperate. You think he'd say yes? Dorman asked. Ask him, Emily suggested. He's probably down at Kelly's dock right now, mending nets for 5 cents a fathom. You could offer him something better than that. Dorman found Edward exactly where Emily had predicted, hunched over a tangle of fishing net with the focused intensity of someone who couldn't afford to miss a stitch. At 17, Edward had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man, though his freckled baby face still carried traces of boyhood uncertainty. Mornin', Eddie, Dorman called, approaching with careful casualness. Edward looked up, surprise flickering across his boyish face. Darm. Heard you had some excitement day other night. Engine trouble. Something like that, Dorman confirmed, settling beside him. Listen, I've been tinkin'. I could use some help with the rows. Someone reliable who knows the water. Interest sparked in Edward's dark eyes, though he kept his voice level. What kind of help? I'll be honest with you, Eddie, I'm a little embarrassed, Dorman truthfully admitted. I needs help fishing, Eddie. I can do the work. No problem with that. I just don't know all the techniques and tricks. You know, like you do. Dorman hesitated. He looked at Edward. He was staring back at Dorman with his mouth gaping open. No words. Dorman continued. Crew work. Share of the catch. Plus, other opportunities if they come up. Dorman chose his words carefully, watching Edward's reaction. Regular work, decent pay. No questions about how or why, but I needs your expertise too, if you're willing. Edward's hands stilled on the net. He was intelligent enough to read between the lines, and Dorman saw the moment understanding dawned on Big Eddie, followed immediately by a hunger that spoke of genuine desperation. My fatter, Edward began, then stopped, swallowing hard. I knows about your fatter, Dorman said gently, and I knows your family needs income. Steady income. So does mine. I understands, Eddie. Your family is counting on you, just like mine is counting on me. For a long moment, Edward turned his gaze out at the harbor, his jaw working as he considered the offer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, his eyes holding back tears. "When can I start?" Edward proved to be everything Dorman and Emily had hoped and more. Strong enough to handle the heavy work, his knowledge and experience of fishing, and he was discreet enough to ask no questions when Dorman made certain modifications to the Briny Rose's storage arrangements. Within a week, they'd settled into an efficient partnership that made the daily fishing runs both more profitable and safer. It was one Wednesday morning when everything changed. They'd been working the grounds off Ramia Island, hauling trot lines in weather that should have been perfect, calm seas, light wind, clear visibility. But the Newfoundland coast was notorious for sudden changes, and by mid-afternoon, the sky had turned an ominous shade of green-black that made both young men nervous. "We should head on in," Edward suggested, eyeing the building clouds. "This looks like it's going to blow hard." Dorman nodded agreement, but as they secured their gear, the first violent gust hit like a huge punch, a direct blast of wind side on, heeling the Briny Rose over until a little water actually poured across her gunnels before she rolled back upright. The storm had arrived faster and fiercer than either had anticipated, that either boy had experienced ever before, for that matter, in their short careers so far as fishermen. "Get the dory ready," Dorman shouted over the rising wind. "If she goes down, we'll need—" His words were lost as another massive gust struck, this time catching the small dory they kept secured amidships. The violent motion tore it from its lashings, and Edward lunged forward instinctively, trying to grab the tow line before it was lost overboard. The deck was slick with spray and rain. Edward's feet went out from under him as the Briny Rose lurched, and he tumbled over the side with a splash that was barely audible over the storm's roar. Dorman's world narrowed to a single, terrible sight. Edward thrashing in the water beside the Rose, his heavy oilskins dragging him down. The older boy's face was a mask of terror as he struggled against the weight of his clothing and the increasing swells. "I can't swim," Edward gasped, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "Darm, I can't—" Without conscious thought, Dorman shed his oilskins and outerwear and dove in after Edward. The shock of the cold Atlantic water drove the breath from his lungs, but training took over. Summers spent swimming off the sandbanks, skills learned from necessity in a fishing family. He fought through the icy embrace, kicking hard toward Edward's struggling form. The older boy was already starting to sink when Dorman reached him, panic making him thrash wildly and nearly dragging them both under. Dorman managed to get an arm around Edward's chest, fighting to keep both their heads above the increasingly violent waves. "Stop fighting!" Dorman shouted. "I got you. Stop fighting and let me do the work." Edward went limp with desperate trust, allowing Dorman to begin the exhausting swim toward the nearest land. Behind them, the Briny Rose drifted away in the storm, her engine off and her anchor up. Dorman watched his father's boat disappear into the gray curtain of rain and felt his heart break as he kicked harder toward shore. The swim to Boar Island was the longest 20 minutes of Dorman's life. Every stroke was a battle against cold, exhaustion, and the growing weight of Edward's waterlogged clothing. Waves broke over their heads repeatedly, filling their mouths with salt water and driving them toward the rocky shore with dangerous force. When they finally crashed onto the island's small beach, both boys lay gasping in the shallows for several minutes, too spent to move. Edward was blue with cold and shaking uncontrollably, but he was alive. "You saved me," he stuttered, his whole body violently shaking. "You left your boat, your father's boat, to save me." Dorman nodded weakly, not trusting his voice. The loss of the Briny Rose and his entire stash of tins felt like a physical wound, a missing limb, something he couldn't think about right then. But watching Edward's chest rise and fall made the sacrifice worthwhile. "Why?" Edward asked, struggling to sit up in the shallow water. "Why would you risk everything for me?" "'Cause you're me crew, Eddie," Dorman replied. "It's simple, I'm the captain, and this captain don't leave any crew behind." Edward stared at him for a long moment, something profound shifting in his dark eyes. When he spoke again, His voice carried the weight of an oath. "I owes you me life, Dorman Keating. Me life and everything that comes with it." He struggled to his knees in the sand, still shaking uncontrollably, water streaking from his hair. "From this day until I dies, your enemies are me enemies. Your secrets are me secrets. Your battles are me battles. I swears it, Darm." The formal words, delivered with such intensity, felt like something ceremonial, some sort of ancient ritual of brotherhood. Dorman recognized the importance of what Edward was offering, not just loyalty, but blood loyalty, the kind of bond that would hold against any pressure. "You don't have to," Dorman began. "Yes, I do," Edward interrupted firmly. "You jumped into dat water without thinking about yourself. Risked your life, your boat, your future. For me, dat kind of debt can't be paid back with money or work. It takes a life debt." Dorman helped Edward to higher ground, both of them shivering from cold and adrenaline in their soaked clothes. Around them, the storm continued to rage, but they'd found shelter in a small cave that provided protection from the worst of the wind and rain. As they huddled together for warmth, Dorman couldn't help but think about the Rose. He'd lost his father's boat, the vessel that represented 3 generations of honest fishing. Dorman was set to be the 4th. Yet in saving Edward's life, he'd gained something perhaps equally valuable. Absolute loyalty from someone, Dorm had no doubt, who understood the true meaning of the word. When the storm finally passed and they were rescued by Billy Spencer's boat the following morning, Edward's transformation was complete. Where once he'd been a hired hand, he was now something closer to a sworn brother, the kind of ally who would follow Dorman into any darkness, no matter how deep. Later from the dock, they watched the briny Rose being towed back to shore, damaged but salvageable, recovered by search boats after the storm. The vessel had run aground on sandy shoals near the sandbanks. Dorman realized that sometimes the most valuable treasures were found not in hidden compartments or smuggled goods, but in the fierce loyalty of those willing to risk everything for your cause. Edward Kearley was more than just crew. He was Dorman's lieutenant. For Dorman, Eddie had quickly morphed into his personal protection, a profitable partnership, and devoted blood brother, all wrapped into one formidable package. Whatever challenges lay ahead in Dorman's increasingly dangerous enterprises, he would no longer face them alone. Not only did he have the brains and the beauty of Emily Parsons, but also the brawn of Big Eddie Kearley. Chapter 3. Spring arrived in Burgeo like a cautious visitor, melting the harbor ice in fits and starts while keeping winter's promise close at hand. By May of 1953, Dorman had found his rhythm. 3 days fishing with Edward, building their reputation as reliable young fishermen, and carefully spacing their other activities to avoid drawing attention from Constable Griggs, who still made a habit of watching the harbor from his morning walks. It seemed he was always poking around. The business, as Emily insisted on calling it, had grown beyond Dorman's most optimistic expectations. What had begun as desperate sales to Billy Spencer had evolved into a network of discreet customers throughout the coastal communities. Billy proved an excellent middleman, introducing Dorman to visiting fishermen from Corner Brook, and even a merchant from North Sydney who paid premium prices for quality French rum. 28 tins sold since winter, Emily announced during one of their planning sessions on Barter's Rock, her careful bookkeeping spread across the flat stone like a merchant's ledger. Average price $32 per tin. Total income $896. Edward whistled low, shaking his head in amazement. Even after Billy's commission and their own living expenses, it was more money than any of their families had seen in years. "My father's medicine alone cost $60 last month," Edward said quietly. Dis is keeping him alive longer than the doctors expected." Dorman nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. Edward's father had been bedridden with cancer since last autumn. The Kearleys had to sell their boat, and Edward wasn't able to make enough doing odd jobs. The Kearleys had always struggled, it seemed, more than most, but Mr. Kearley's illness had pushed them to the brink. The expensive treatments they could now afford had eased his pain and bought precious time. Margaret's own health had improved dramatically once they could afford proper food, coal for warmth, and visits from Dr. Parsons when her cough returned. "We're down to 22 tins," Emily continued, her finger tracing columns of figures. "At this rate, we'll be out of inventory by September." Nobody liked the thought of that. Their inherited supply was finite, and eventually they'd face a choice: quit while they were ahead or find new sources. "Sebastian Martel has been asking questions about us, according to Billy anyways," offered Edward. "Louis Martel's nephew. He runs the family business now. Right after your uncle got killed, Louis got locked up like your dad. Word is he's looking for reliable partners on this side of the water." The name had sparked recognition in Dorman. Uncle Danny had mentioned the Louis Martel during his final days. He was part of a big French merchant family from Saint-Pierre, involved in the import business for generations. But approaching them would mean crossing a line from selling inherited contraband to active smuggling. "What do you think?" Dorman asked Emily, though he suspected he already knew her answer. Emily's blue eyes held the calculating look he'd grown to recognize. "I think Sebastian Martel might be exactly what we needs, but we'd have to be very, very careful about how we approach him." Edward shifted uncomfortably on the rock. "Of course, Darm. This is getting into serious territory. One thing to sell what we already had, in order to start actual smuggling and running rum." He paused. "I mean, I'm with ya. You knows that, Darm. I means, it sounds like an adventure, but this is a big deal. We gotta remember that." "Eddie's right," Dorman agreed, though part of him was already imagining the possibilities. "More risk means more chance of getting caught." "But also more reward," Emily pointed out. "And we'd be in control of our own supply instead of dependent on what your Uncle Danny left behind." The discussion was interrupted by the appearance of Constable Griggs on the path below, making his usual patrol. The three teenagers fell silent, watching the Mountie walk past without apparent notice. But Emily's sharp eyes caught something the others missed. He could never hear what the kids were saying up on the rock, not from down on the trail. It was 20 more feet climb up the cliff to reach to top of Barter's rock, but he was paying attention. "He's watching us," Emily murmured. "Has been for weeks. Not obvious about it, but I've noticed him around whenever we're together." A chill ran down Dorman's spine. "You think he suspects something?" "I think he's a good cop doing his job," Emily replied, "which means we needs to be even more careful." By June, their fishing operation was genuinely successful. The briny Rose, properly repaired with their earnings, ran smooth and true. Edward's knowledge, combined with Dorman's inherited instincts as captain of the briny Rose, had made them one of the more reliable crews in Burgeo's small fleet of fishermen. Their legitimate catches provided perfect cover for their other activities, and the income helped support both families without raising suspicions. Margaret had noticed the improvement, of course. "You boys are doing remarkable well for such young fishermen," she commented one evening as Dorman counted out money for household expenses. "Eddie knows the water better than anyone our age," Dorman replied, which was true enough. "And the Rose is running better now that we can afford proper maintenance." "Your fatter would be proud," Margaret said, though something in her voice suggested she harbored suspicions about their sudden prosperity. Letters from Jack arrived monthly now, carried by the slow, grinding machinery of the prison system. Each envelope bore the institutional stamp of Dorchester Penitentiary, and Dorman always felt a mixture of anticipation and dread when Margaret handed them over with her careful, unreadable expression. The letters themselves were cautiously worded, Jack knowing full well that prison censors read every line before the mail went out, but they still managed to convey the ache of separation and a father's fierce pride in what his son had managed to accomplish. "Tell your mother her boy has become quite the businessman," the latest letter had said, written in Jack's careful, measured handwriting. "Managing both boat and family at such a young age takes the kind of responsibility that would challenge any grown man. People respect a man who takes care of his own." Dorman had read that passage several times, feeling the weight of his father's approval even as guilt twisted in his stomach. If only Jack knew the full extent of that business, the growing web of contacts and customers that now stretched along half the South Coast. Would his father still be proud if he understood that his son had not only followed in his footsteps, but had surpassed him entirely? It gnawed at Dorman to know that he'd become exactly what Jack had tried so hard to avoid becoming, a successful smuggler. Dorman couldn't make it at fishing cod either. Maybe fishing, Dorman thought, was something of the past. He knew he was no good at fishing and the incentive to get better at it. For Dorman, it just wasn't there for him. Not with easier ways to make money, lots of money. Dorman was good at that. There was no doubt about it. And he was enjoying it. Yet reading his father's words of praise made the burden feel heavier. Every risk he took, every sleepless night spent calculating routes and timing, was for the family Jack could no longer provide for from behind Dorchester's gray walls. It was Dorman's responsibility, and he was getting the job done. Meanwhile, Constable Griggs had been methodically building a case, or at least trying to. Dorman often spotted him in conversation with harbor masters from surrounding outports, or carefully examining shipping manifests at the dock. The Mountie had taken to walking past the Keating home on his evening rounds, sometimes stopping to chat with Margaret about mundane matters, while his eyes took in every detail of their improving circumstances. "He visited the shop yesterday," Lucy Lake had whispered to Dorman, "asking my fatter about who's been buying extra supplies, who's got money to spend these days." Dorman had learned enough from his father's mistakes to recognize the tightening net of investigation. But unlike Jack, he had youth and a deep understanding of Burgeo's hidden paths on his side. For every move Griggs made, Dorman, Emily, and Edward adjusted their operations accordingly. The breakthrough with Sebastian Martel came in July, facilitated by Billy Spencer, but conducted with Emily's careful planning. The meeting was arranged for a foggy evening at the sandbanks, where the vast dunes provided privacy and multiple escape routes if needed. Sebastian proved to be a little older than Dorman was expecting, in his late 20s with the hardened confidence of someone raised in the family business. He spoke English with the musical accent of St. Pierre that sounded much like their own. His clothes were cut in a continental style that marked him as distinctly foreign. "Billy Spencer speaks well of your discretion," Sebastian began, settling onto a driftwood log with casual grace. "My uncle always valued reliable partners." "We knew your uncle's work by reputation," Emily replied smoothly, taking the lead in negotiations as they'd planned. "Quality merchandise, fair deals, no unnecessary complications." Sebastian smiled, clearly impressed by her directness. "You understand the business, then?" "Good. Too many amateurs think smuggling is just about moving cargo from point A to point B. But it's really about relationships. It's about trust and mutual benefit." "What kind of relationship are you proposing?" Dorman asked. "A straightforward partnership. You provide secure transportation and handle local distribution. I supply premium merchandise, quality rum, cigarettes, luxury items that are scarce into outports. We split all profits 50-50 after covering all operating expenses." The terms were generous, surprisingly so. Emily asked the questions that Dorman wouldn't have thought of: delivery schedules, payment methods, what happened if cargo was seized. "1/4 payment up front, remainder on delivery," Sebastian explained. "If cargo is lost to bad weather or mechanical failure, we share the loss. If it's lost to law enforcement," he shrugged eloquently, "that's the risk we all take in this business. And if someone gets caught, lawyers cost plenty, but they earn their pay. My family keeps a few particular legal types on retainer, ones who know their way around customs issues." Sebastian's smile had a confident edge. "But remember, the best strategy is always staying one step ahead of those who might come looking." Before they finalized anything, Sebastian shared information that chilled them all. "There's something you should know about the current situation," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We've been facing trouble with competitors lately, mainland operations, powerful ones, trying to force their way into what's always been our territory." "What kind of competitor?" Emily asked. "Men from Halifax and Boston, Italian names, big connections with mafia. They called their operation Romano Enterprises, led by a man named Vincent Romano. Sebastian's expression darkened. They call him Vinny. Our sources believe they're the ones responsible for what happened to your Uncle Danny and getting your father arrested. Dorman felt as though he'd been doused with ice water. What do you mean? From what my contacts in the RCMP and the French Customs Office have told me, Vinny's people knew about the exchange at McAllister's stage. Someone tipped off the Mounties, then Vinny's crew showed up, likely hoping to eliminate competition and steal the cargo. Vinny has a reputation of outgunning and outrunning the authorities on a few occasions. Sebastian's tone was careful, measured. I can't say for certain they targeted your uncle specifically, but I hear of rumors. Rumors about your Uncle Danny, about him turning Vinny down. And well, you know. The revelation came to Dorman. Uncle Danny's death hadn't been just a smuggling deal gone wrong. It had been part of a deliberate strategy to control the territory. And his father? His father was in prison because of Romano's interference. Why are you telling us this? Edward asked, his voice tight with anger. Sebastian's eyes turned hard as flint. Because if you're going to work with us, you need to understand what's at stake. Romano wants to control every drop of rum that moves from St. Pierre to Halifax. Anyone standing in his way? He left the rest unspoken, the silence more chilling than any threat he could have voiced. Emily leaned forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity Dorman had never seen before. What can we do about it? Be careful, be smart, and if you ever encounter Romano's people, don't try to be heroes. Sebastian's warning carried the weight of hard experience. These men don't see violence as personal. It's just business to them. They calculate every move based on profit and territory. Despite the sobering warnings, they agreed to Sebastian's proposal. The first shipment would be small, a test run to establish trust and procedures. But before jumping in, the teenagers spent weeks learning the trade properly. Sebastian arranged for Edward and Dorman to meet with an experienced boat captain in Francois, who taught them the hidden approaches to St. Pierre, how to spot patrol boats, and some French sailor techniques of navigation in fog and darkness. Emily, meanwhile, found herself learning practical skills from Sebastian himself. How to evaluate merchandise quality, negotiate prices with suppliers, some tips on the metric system, and how to manage the careful timing that kept inventory moving without creating obvious patterns. Billy Spencer shared his knowledge of distribution networks, who could be trusted, who paid promptly, and who might inform to the authorities if pressured. Their first shipment arrived in mid-August, 10 tins of premium rum, 2 cases of American cigarettes, and a huge assortment of silk stockings and French perfume that Emily insisted would sell well to the wives and daughters of successful fishermen. Women in outports have money now, thanks to the baby bonus and better fishing, she explained as they inventoried the goods in the Briny Rose's hidden compartment. They wants nice things, but they can't get them easily. We can provide data, at a premium, of course, she added. She was right. The luxury and cosmetic items sold faster than anyone expected, often at prices that made Dorman dizzy. A bottle of perfume that cost them $3 fetched $15 from a merchant's wife in Ramia. Silk stockings purchased for 75 cents a pair, sold for $4 in many of the coastal outports all the way around to Corner Brook. They couldn't keep them in stock. We're not just smugglers anymore, Emily observed with satisfaction. We're luxury retailers. The summer passed in a blur of activity. 3 fishing trips per week maintained their legitimate cover, while carefully planned runs to St. Pierre brought in merchandise that was almost entirely pre-sold to Billy's and Emily's expanding network of customers. The profits were substantial enough to transform their families' lives without being so obvious as to attract unwanted attention. Everyone involved had stashes of cash hidden away. The teenagers found themselves with far more money than they could spend without drawing attention. Even Lucy Lake was on the payroll. Being a permanent fixture at the shop, in her prying mind, made her information very useful at times. Everyone in Burgeo made their way to the shop sooner than later. Dorman's mother stopped coughing entirely once they could afford fresh meat and fish regularly and proper medicine when needed. Edward's father lived through the summer in relative comfort, his pain managed by expensive medications that extended both his life and the quality of his remaining time. Both families moved from survival to something approaching prosperity. But prosperity brought its own dangers. Constable Griggs made his presence felt throughout the summer, not obviously investigating, but always watching. He attended church services where the Keatings and Parsons families worshipped. He made casual conversation with fishermen at the harbor, asking innocent questions about catches and weather. He befriended elderly residents who remembered the old days, listening to stories about past smuggling operations with apparent academic interest. One afternoon in late July, Griggs cornered Dorman at the dock as he was unloading the day's catch. "Impressive haul for such a young crew," the Mountie observed, helping Dorman lift a crate of cod onto the wharf. "You've got your uncle's knack for finding the fish." "Just lucky today," Dorman replied, keeping his expression neutral. "Luck seems to follow you these days." Griggs's tone was conversational, but his eyes were sharp. "Your mother's looking well. New coat, I noticed. The fishing's been good this summer." "So I see." Griggs glanced at the briny Rose, taking in her fresh paint and new rigging. "Boat's in fine shape, too. Must be costing a pretty penny to keep her that way." "We work hard," Dorman said, meeting the Mountie's gaze directly. "My fatter taught me that good maintenance pays for itself." Griggs nodded slowly. "Your father was a good man who made one bad decision, Dorman. I'd hate to see history repeat itself." The warning was clear enough. "He's building a picture," Emily warned during one of their August planning sessions. "Connecting dots, establishing patterns. We needs to be more careful about our communications." They developed a system of signals. Chalk marks on specific fence posts, arranged items in Emily's third-story bedroom window, visible from Barter's Rock. Coded and uncoded messages passed through Lucy Lake at her father's shop. They staggered their meetings, never gathered all three in public, and varied their routes to avoid patterns. The system served them well until late August, when everything began to unravel. Edward failed to appear for their scheduled fishing trip on a Tuesday morning. Dorman waited at the harbor until nearly 7 o'clock before going to the Kearley house to investigate. He found Janice Kearley crumpled on the front step, cradling little Jessie against her chest. Her face was ravaged, eyes puffy and rimmed with angry red, swollen from what must have been hours of weeping. When she looked up at Dorman, her hands began to flutter and shake in the air between them, desperate to shape the horror into words that wouldn't come. Jessie whimpered against her mother's shoulder, while Janice's mouth worked silently before finally finding her voice. "They took him," she sobbed. "Three men with mainland accents. Said they had business with him. When Eddie tried to resist, oh, Dorm, what did they do to him?" Dorman's felt rage inside. "Where is he now?" "Dr. Parsons got him. They beat him terrible bad, Darm. Left him at the crossroads like garbage with a message." "I'll look after him, Mrs. Kearley, don't you worry," Dorman said softly before turning and running. Dr. Parsons met Dorman at the clinic door. His usually kind expression settled into grim professional lines. "I won't lie to you, Darm. It's bad. 3 broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, concussion. Whoever did this didn't care if he lived. They kicked and stomped the shit out of him, Darm. It's a miracle he is still alive." "He's too stubborn to die, Doctor. Can I see him?" Dorm asked. "Briefly, but understand he's in considerable pain and may not be fully coherent." Edward lay on the examination table like broken driftwood, his face so swollen and discolored that Dorman barely recognized him. One eye was completely closed, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Dorman leaned in close and whispered softly, "Big Eddie," taking his friend's hand carefully. Edward's good eye opened, focusing on Dorman with effort. "They said you'd better learn from this," he managed through split lips. "Warned you to get out, or worse would happen the next time. It was Vinny's guys, from Boston. There was tree of dem." Don't worry about that now, Dorman said, though rage was building in his chest like a winter storm. Just focus on getting better. Darn. Edward's grip tightened weakly. Day newtings. About our trips to St. Pierre. About Sebastian. The implications hit Dorman. Romano's people hadn't just randomly targeted them. They had specific information about their operations. Someone in their network had betrayed them, or someone had been watching more carefully than they'd realized. Dorman's hand went instinctively to his pocket, fingers closing around Uncle Danny's penknife. He pulled it out, the pearl handle feeling cool in his hand. Opening and closing it repeatedly, he found himself wishing Uncle Danny were here to advise him. Danny would know what to do about Romano's men. The knife's blade caught the light as Dorman snapped it open once more. It was still razor sharp, maintained with almost religious dedication since it had come into his possession. Sometimes he imagined he could feel his uncle's presence through the handle of the knife. They didn't finish me, 'cause... Edward struggled getting words out. Dorman understood what he meant. If Romano's organization was truly ruthless, why leave Edward alive? You're too stubborn to die that easy, Dorm replied. One of them, the boss I think, said this was just business. Said they weren't interested in murder charges, they just wanted the territory. Edward winced as a wave of pain hit him. Said if you were smart, you'd take the warning and find another line of work. It was a calculated move, Dorman realized. Romano's people were treating this as a business negotiation. Brutal, but with clear terms. They wanted the Keating operation shut down, and maybe they were giving Dorman a chance to walk away. Emily found him that evening sitting alone on Barter's Rock, staring out at the dark water that had brought so much fortune and now so much trouble into their lives. I just checked in on Eddie, she said quietly, settling beside him on the cold stone. Daddy says he'll recover like new, but it'll take time. He'll live, but it was a message for me. For us. Dorman's voice was flat, drained of emotion. They want us out of the business? And what do you want to do? Emily asked as she sat down close to him. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Dorman thought about Edward lying broken in Dr. Parsons' clinic, about his father locked away in Dorchester because of Romano's interference, about Uncle Danny bleeding out in the rain while his murderers escaped into the fog. I want to finish what we started, he said finally, but I won't risk anyone else getting hurt. Emily moved closer, her hand finding his in the darkness. Then we'll have to be smarter, more careful, and maybe, she paused considering her words, maybe we needs to think about fighting back instead of just running. What are you saying, Emily? I mean, this Romano has made it personal now. He interfered with your uncle's operation, got your father imprisoned, and nearly killed Eddie. At some point, backing down just encourages more bullying. Dorman stared at her, seeing a hardness in her profile that was both beautiful and frightening. Emily Parsons, the doctor's daughter who had once worried about being late for Sunday school, was talking about fighting back against organized crime. Emily, these aren't schoolyard bullies. They're dangerous men, Dorman said. These are real gangsters, and you ain't Bonnie and I ain't Clyde. I know, but they're also businessmen, and businessmen understand profit and loss. Her voice carried a cold calculation that sent chills down his spine. Maybe it's time they learned that targeting our operation costs more than it's worth. And no, she continued, I ain't Bonnie, I is the doctor's daughter. And you, Dorman Keating, you're the smuggler's son. How we gonna make 'em pay? Dorman sighed. We start by finding out who's been informing to them. Then we build better alliances. Sebastian mentioned otter families in St. Pierre, who compete with Romano, and we make sure our operation is too valuable to shut down, become essential to all the communities we serve. As they sat in the darkness, listening to waves crash against the shore below, Dorman realized that the boy who had first opened a hidden compartment 8 months earlier was gone forever. In his place sat someone harder, angrier, and far more determined. The game had changed. Now it was personal. And personal conflicts, Dorman was beginning to understand, had different rules entirely. Chapter 4. The morning after Edward's beating, Dorman stood in the hidden hold of the Briny Rose, counting what remained of his inheritance. 21 tins, each one worth $25 straight up to Billy Spencer, more if he could find buyers willing to pay premium prices. Nearly $800 in contraband rum, but the cost of keeping it was rising faster than its value. He traced his fingers along the brass nail head that opened the compartment, remembering his father's careful instructions. Press twice, slide the panel. Simple mechanics hiding dangerous secrets. Everything about this business had seemed simple once. Buy low from Sebastian, sell high in Burgeo, use the profits to keep his family afloat. Now blood was mixed into the arithmetic. "Darm!" Emily's voice carried down from the deck above. "Someone's coming!" He quickly closed the compartment and climbed the ladder to find Emily watching a small boat approach through the morning mist. The vessel moved with purpose, cutting directly toward the Rose's mooring rather than following the meandering path of a casual visitor. "You recognize him?" Dorman asked, squinting at the approaching figure. "Sebastian," Emily said, looking through the binoculars. "And he looks worried." The young Frenchman tied off his boat with quick, efficient movements, then climbed aboard the Rose without his usual easy smile. His clothes were rumpled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. "We needs to talk," Sebastian said without greeting, his accent thicker than usual. "Away from Dis Arbor. Too many years around here now." A few minutes later, they were anchored in a sheltered cove 2 miles from town, surrounded by nothing but granite cliffs and wheeling gulls. Sebastian pulled out a bottle of French brandy and took a long drink before speaking, reaching out to offer the bottle to Dorman. "No tanks, we don't drink," Dorman said. "My Uncle Louis, he's been transferred to a prison in France," Sebastian began. "But before they moved him, he got word to me. Vinnie Romano's people, they didn't just target your operation by chance. They've been planning this for months." "What do you mean?" Dorman asked, though cold certainty was already settling in his stomach. "Romano wants control of the whole South Coast trade. Every boat, every contact, every drop of rum that moves between the French islands and Newfoundland." Sebastian's knuckles whitened around the bottle. "Your Uncle Danny, your fatter, they weren't just unfortunate casualties. They were examples. They were set up." Emily leaned forward. "Examples of what?" "That's what happens to people who don't join his organization or get out of his way." Sebastian turned to face Dorman, his eyes dark with warning. "Your Uncle Danny refused to deal with Dem or step aside. Romano's been picking off independent operators one by one. Some he brings into the fold, others he wipes out completely. Either way, he ends up controlling everything." The implications crashed over Dorman like a rogue wave. His father wasn't in prison because of bad luck or poor timing. Uncle Danny wasn't dead because they happened to be in the wrong place. They had been deliberately targeted by a man building an empire on the bones of Newfoundland's traditional smuggling networks. "Are you positive? How do you know all this?" Dorman asked. Sebastian hesitated, then pulled out a crumpled letter. "Because Romano tried to recruit me last week, sent this to me in St. Pierre, offering to make me his exclusive supplier for the French islands." He handed over the paper. "He wants to meet." Dorman read the letter twice, his blood beginning to simmer. Who does this Romano think he is? The words on the page were all smooth business talk, but beneath the polite phrases and professional language, Dorman could feel the knife edge of the threat. Romano wasn't offering Sebastian an opportunity. He was demanding surrender, dressed up in fancy words and false courtesy. "What did you tell him?" Dorman asked. "Not yet, but he's not patient, this one. My contacts in Halifax say he's already moved against 2 operators in Nova Scotia who refused his offers. One disappeared, the other's boat was found burned to the waterline. That guy, he packed up and moved away." Emily was quiet for a long moment, studying the letter. "What does he want from the meeting?" "To make me an offer I can't refuse, I expect. Join his organization as a supplier, give him control of my St. Pierre connections, and take a percentage instead of full profits. Sebastian's voice carried bitter resignation. Or resist and end up like your uncle. So you're going to accept? Dorman asked, surprised by how much the idea stung. No, mon ami. I didn't say dat. Sebastian's eyes hardened. My family's been running goods between these islands for generations. I don't plan to become Romano's employee without a fight. Then what are you proposing? Dorman asked. Sebastian smiled for the first time since arriving, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. I'm proposing we give Romano exactly what he wants. A meeting, but not the kind he's expecting. I'll convince him he ought to recruit you and set up a meeting. Sebastian, Emily said carefully, you're talking about... I'm talking about ambush. I'm talking about survival, he cut her off. Romano thinks he can intimidate us because we're just local smugglers, small-time operators who don't understand how real criminals work. His accent thickening as his anger rose. But he's made one mistake. He's assuming we'll play by his rules. Strangely, there again was that feeling, Dorman recognized. It was like fear somehow. Or was it fear turning into something else? Something intoxicating, something addictive. What kind of meeting did you have in mind? Dorman asked. The kind where Romano learns that killing Danny Keating and beating Edward Kearley as consequences. Sebastian took another drink. The kind where he discovers that some of us aren't impressed by mainland tough guys who think they can sail into our waters and take over. Emily was watching both of them with calculating eyes. You're talking about ambush. And I'm talking about justice, Sebastian replied. It's the only way to deal with this bully. Vinny won't stop with just us. He'll keep expanding, keep killing, until he controls every smuggling operation from Halifax to the Grand Banks. Someone has to make a stand. Dorman thought about Edward lying broken in Dr. Parsons' clinic, about his father locked away in Dorchester, about Uncle Danny bleeding out in the rain while his killers escaped. The anger he'd been carrying for months crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. What do you suggest we do? Dorman asked. Sebastian's smile widened. First, we needs to get Romano to come to us instead of meeting him on his terms, somewhere isolated where his mainland advantages don't matter. And then we remind him that the North Atlantic doesn't forgive greedy, and neither do we. Dorman stared at Sebastian across the cramped cabin of the Rose, the weight of the man's words settling like stones in his chest. The lantern light flickered between them, casting shifting shadows that made Sebastian's scarred face look even more dangerous. You're asking me to kill a man, Dorman said quietly. I'm asking you to defend yourself, Sebastian corrected. Romano's already decided your fate, mon ami. Question is whether you'll meet it on your knees or standing up. I'll try and convince him to meet with you. That part shouldn't be hard. Emily shifted beside Dorman, her knee brushing his. There is to be another way. Contact the RCMP. Tell them about Romano. Tell them what? Sebastian's laugh was bitter. That a man from Boston is trying to take over my smuggling operations? They'd arrest us before they'd go after him. He leaned forward. Besides, Vinny's got connections. Half the reason he's been so successful is he knows which palms to grease. Dorman thought about Constable Griggs, always watching, always suspicious. He doubted anyone could grease his palms. Would Griggs believe them? Or would he see it as an opportunity to finally arrest the boy whose father he'd sent to prison? What exactly are you proposing? Dorman asked. Sebastian pulled a folded chart from his jacket, spreading it across the small table. Vinny wants to meet in neutral waters, somewhere between St. Pierre and Burgeo. He suggested this area. His finger traced a spot roughly halfway between the islands and Newfoundland's coast. He thinks it shows good faith, not favoring either side. But it's also where the currents run strongest. Tricky navigation, easy to get turned around in fog. Sebastian's finger moved to mark several small islands. And there's places here where a boat could disappear and never be found. Emily studied the chart. You know these waters? Like the back of me hand. Been fishing and running goods here since I was younger Dan Dorman. Sebastian looked up. Romano's bringing mainland muscle, But they don't know our waters. That's our advantage. Dorman tried to imagine it. Sebastian's boat meeting Romano's in open water, men with guns facing off while the Atlantic swirled around them. The image made his stomach clench. How many men does he usually travel with? 2, maybe 3. Enough to intimidate, not enough to draw attention. Sebastian rolled up the chart. But armed, definitely armed to the teeth. These aren't fishermen playing at being tough. And you think we can take them? Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. I think we can surprise them. And I think desperate men fighting for their home territory have the advantage. Dorman felt Emily watching him, gauging his reaction. He thought about Edward's swollen face, about his mother's worried letters, about the photograph of Uncle Danny he kept hidden in his room. Romano had taken so much from them already. When would it stop? What would you need from me? Your boat, Sebastian said immediately. DeRose is known, trusted. If we tell Romano I'm bringing Dorman Keating to the meeting, he'll expect to see your boat. Makes it look legitimate. And what about Emily and Edward? Emily stays on shore, replied Sebastian. This isn't— The hell I do, Emily interrupted, her voice sharp. You think I've come this far to sit on the dock while you two sail off to get yourselves killed? Sebastian shook his head. It's too dangerous. If something goes wrong, then you'll need all the help you can get. Emily's chin lifted with stubborn determination. Besides, who else knows Romano's organization well enough to identify his men? You've studied them? Asked Sebastian. Someone had to. Emily pulled a small notebook from her jacket, pages covered with her neat handwriting. I've been tracking every boat that's come through here since Edward got beaten. Strange vessels, timing patterns, crew descriptions from fishermen who've seen them. She opened to a page marked with careful sketches. Romano's got at least 5 men working for him along this coast. 3 of them were on the boat that killed Uncle Danny. Sebastian examined her notes, his eyebrows rising. This is thorough. I don't do anything halfway. Emily met his gaze steadily. And I don't let my partners face danger alone. Dorman felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. Emily's courage amazed him, but the thought of her facing armed men made his hands shake. What about Edward? He asked. Still recovering, Emily answered. Daddy says he shouldn't be doing any heavy work for another week at least. Good, he stays home. Dorman's voice was firm. Edward's been hurt enough because of this business. Sebastian nodded approvingly. Sure. Too many people makes it complicated. He stood pacing the small cabin. So we have 3 people, 2 boats, and the advantage of knowing these waters. We can hide in the seal rocks. Vinny has more men and better weapons, but he's fighting on our terms. When? Dorman asked. The sooner the better. Every day we wait, he gets stronger, brings more men into the area. Sebastian checked his watch. I can send word to Vinny tonight, arrange a meeting for 3 days from now. Gives us time to prepare, scout the area. Emily was studying her notes again. We'll need weapons. I've got a rifle, Sebastian said, and a shotgun. You? I can get Daddy's revolver. He'd never miss it. He was issued it in the war, said Emily. Both Sebastian and Emily turned to Dorman. Dorman thought about the .303 Lee Enfield, the old bolt-action rifle his father kept locked in the closet at home. It was from the First World War. He'd used it only a couple of times, never imagined pointing it at a man. I can get a rifle, but I've never really used it to shoot a— Dorman confessed. Shoot at a person? Sebastian's voice was gentler. Let's hope you don't have to learn. But if it comes to that, remember, they started this war when they killed your uncle. We're just finishing it. The wind picked up outside, rattling the Rose's rigging. Somewhere in the darkness, other boats moved through the night, some carrying honest fishermen, others smuggling goods. And soon, perhaps, one of those boats would hold Vinny Romano and his mafia men with their fancy machine guns. If so, Dorman was determined to be at the ready. Dorman looked at Emily, seeing his own fear and determination reflected in her eyes. They were past the point of backing down now. 3 days, he said finally. We'll be ready. 3 days had never felt so long. Dorman moved through the hours like a man walking underwater, every task slowed by the weight of what was coming. On the second day, Edward returned to fishing on the briny Rose. He was still tender around the ribs and his face was still a mess, but he was determined to work. They mended nets and checked traps, maintaining the routines that had become their cover. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of outport life, something darker was building. "You're quiet today," Edward observed as they hauled their morning catch aboard the Rose. His left eye was still purple around the edges, a reminder of Romano's message. "Just tinking about tings," Dorman said. Edward nodded, understanding without needing details. That was one thing Dorman appreciated about his friend. Edward never pushed for information he wasn't meant to have, but the worry in his expression was plain. "Maybe I should come with you?" Edward asked. "No." Dorman's voice was sharper than he intended. "You're still healing, and besides, someone needs to be here, in case things go wrong. You can look after me, Mum, for me." They worked in silence after that, sorting cod by size, the familiar motions soothing Dorman's nerves. The fish were running well this spring, better than his father had managed in years. If he could just focus on fishing, on the honest work that had sustained 3 generations of Keatings, maybe he could forget about the rifle hidden beneath tarps in the hold, about Sebastian's carefully drawn maps, about Emily's notebook filled with details about men who killed for money. But every time a boat appeared on the horizon, Dorman's heart jumped. Every seabird's cry sounded like a signal. The ordinary world felt thin, transparent, as if the violence lurking underneath might break through at any moment. That afternoon, Emily found him cleaning his father's rifle in the workshop behind their house. Margaret was napping upstairs, her cough finally easing after weeks of pneumonia. The workshop smelled of gun oil and sawdust, familiar scents from childhood afternoons spent watching his father repair nets and gear. "You look terrible," Emily said, settling beside him on the wooden crate that served as a stool. "Feel worse." Dorman worked the bolt action, checking the mechanism as his father had taught him. The rifle was aged but well preserved, its wooden stock polished silky by generations of hands. His father had brought down several caribou with this old gun through the years and a couple moose. "Can't stop me mind from dwelling on what happened to Uncle Danny." "Danny was caught by surprise, but we won't be," replied Emily. "And what if we're wrong? What if this Sebastian feller is playing us? What if Romano's got more men than he's letting on?" The words tumbled out, voicing fears he'd been trying to suppress. "What if we get ourselves killed for nodding?" Emily was quiet for a moment, watching him reassemble the rifle. When she spoke, her voice was steady, certain. "Then we'll die trying to protect our own, instead of waiting for Romano to destroy it piece by piece." She touched his hand, stilling his nervous fidgeting with the bolt. "Darn, what's the alternative? Let him take over completely? Watch more people get beaten like Edward? Wait for the next funeral?" She was right, and he knew it, but knowing didn't make the fear go away. "I've never shot anyone, Em, never even thought about it." "Maybe you won't have to. Maybe just seeing the rifles will be enough to make them think twice." "And what if it isn't?" he said, lowering his head. Emily leaned closer, her blue eyes fierce in the dim workshop light. "Then we'll find out what we're really made of." That evening, Sebastian arrived at dusk, his boat slipping into the dock like a shadow on dark water. He carried a canvas bag that clinked softly when he set it down, extra ammunition, a second rifle, and a flare gun. Sebastian passed the flare gun to Emily. "Romano agreed to the meeting," he reported. "Tomorrow night, midnight at Seal Rocks." Dorman knew the spot, a cluster of granite islets about 5 miles offshore, invisible from land but familiar to anyone who'd fished these waters. Good place for a private conversation, also a good place for an ambush, isolated enough that gunshots wouldn't carry to any idle ears. "He suspects anything?" Emily asked. "Difficult to say. He asked a lot of questions about you, Dorman. Wanted to know why a 14-year-old was worth his time." Sebastian sipped his tea, studying them over the rim. "I told him you controlled more territory than anyone realized, that young men sometimes see opportunities older ones miss." Did he believe it? He'll come to the meeting. Whether he believes it or not, he wants to see for himself. Sebastian set down his cup, his expression growing serious. But don't mistake it for overconfidence. This Vinny, he's paranoid and careful. He'll be watching for tricks. They spent 2 hours going over the plan, marking positions on Sebastian's charts, discussing signals and contingencies. Emily took notes in her careful handwriting, asking questions that made Sebastian nod with approval. She'd thought of details that escaped Dorman entirely: wind direction, tide tables, escape routes if everything went wrong. As Sebastian rolled up the charts, Dorman pulled out Uncle Danny's penknife, turning it over in his hands. This knife from St. Pierre, probably a product of some smuggling run itself. Now it was one of the few tangible connections he had left to his uncle. Nice piece, Sebastian commented, noticing the knife. French craftsmanship, that one. Me uncle gave it to me, Dorman said, clicking it open. The blade was honed to a perfect edge. He'd spent hours maintaining it, especially on nights when sleep wouldn't come. Last thing he ever gave me. Your uncle had good taste, Sebastian nodded appreciatively, and a good eye for quality. Dorman closed the knife and gripped it tightly in his palm, drawing strength from the connection to his uncle. Tomorrow he might face the man responsible for Uncle Danny's death. If Dorman could get close enough to this Vinny Romano, maybe he'd stick him with his uncle's knife. Dorman grinned a little. Now that would be just as he thought. What if someone gets it? Dorman asked as they prepared to leave. The others keep fighting, Sebastian answered bluntly. This isn't a game, boy. Romano would kill all of us if it suited his purposes. We show him the same consideration. Later, walking Emily home through the dark alleyways of Burgeo, Dorman felt the weight of tomorrow settling on his shoulders. The village was quiet, most families already asleep, oil lamps extinguished behind curtained windows. Dogs barked occasionally at shadows or sea sounds, but otherwise only the constant whisper of waves on stone broke the silence. You scared? Emily asked as they reached the Parsons' house. Terrified, Dorman admitted. You? Same. She turned to face him, moonlight catching the determination in her features. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. She kissed him then, quick and fierce, before disappearing through her front door. Dorman stood in the darkness for a long moment, touching his lips, trying to hold on to that moment of sweetness before tomorrow's violence claimed it. The next day dragged like a wounded seal across the ice. Dorman tried to maintain his usual routine, checking nets, mending gear, helping Edward with the engine repairs they'd been putting off. But every movement felt mechanical, performed by someone else while his mind circled endlessly around the evening ahead. Edward worked beside him in silence, the bruises on his face yellow and green, but still visible reminders of Romano's brutality. They'd barely spoken about the beating since it happened, but Dorman could see the anger simmering behind his friend's steady exterior. Edward wanted this confrontation as much as anyone. "You not coming tonight?" Dorman said finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer. Edward looked up from the carburetor he was cleaning. "Try and stop me." "Eddie, I'm serious. You've already paid enough." "Darn!" Edward's voice cut through his protests. "He made it personal when he put hands on me. I'm going. And besides, my job is to protect you. I can't do that back on shore." There was no arguing with that tone. Dorman had heard it before, usually right before Edward did something spectacularly stubborn, like the time he'd insisted on helping Jack repair the wharf during a nor'easter, or when he'd refused to leave the briny rows during the storm that nearly sank them both. "All right," Dorman conceded, "but we stick to the plan. No heroics." Edward grunted something that might have been agreement. By mid-afternoon, word had somehow spread through Burgeo that something was happening. Nothing specific. The village was too small for real secrets. But Dorman caught the looks, the way conversation stopped when he passed. Billy Spencer nodded grimly when Dorman picked up supplies at the tavern. Even Constable Griggs seemed more watchful than usual, his patrol route taking him past the harbor more frequently. "People know," Emily said when she found him at the boat around 4 o'clock. "Know what?" asked Dorman. I don't know exactly. She climbed aboard, moving with the easy confidence she'd developed over months of working on the Rose. Mrs. Tucker asked me if we were expecting visitors tonight. Lucy Lake's been watching the cove all afternoon. Even Fletcher seems nervous. Dorman cursed under his breath. The last thing they needed was the whole town holding its breath. Maybe we should call it off, he said. Too many eyes. It's too late to back out now. Sebastian's already confirmed with Romano. If we don't show, it'll end bad for all of us, I tinks. They spent the remaining daylight hours double-checking equipment, reviewing signals, and trying not to think too hard about what could go wrong. Sebastian arrived as the sun touched the horizon, his boat loaded with additional gear, rope, extra ammunition, and what looked like a small explosive charge. Insurance, he explained when Dorman asked about the charge, in case we need to make a dramatic exit. Margaret appeared as they prepared to cast off, her face pale but determined. She'd said nothing about their plans, but mothers had their own ways of knowing when their children were heading into danger. You come home, she said simply, embracing Dorman. Whatever happens out there, you come home. I will, Mum. All of you, she added, including Emily and Edward in her fierce gaze. This family's lost enough to that man. They cast off as full darkness settled over Burgeo, the briny Rose's engine puttering quietly as they navigated the familiar channels between the islands. Behind them, the village lights twinkled like scattered stars. Ahead lay only black water and the promise of violence. The journey to Seal Rocks took 40 minutes. Sebastian's boat followed at a distance, close enough for support, but far enough to avoid looking like an obvious trap. The plan was simple. Dorman and Emily would appear to arrive alone for the meeting, while Sebastian and Edward positioned themselves among the rocks with rifles. Sebastian's boat would be hidden by rocks and darkness. Emily would stay below on the Rose, ready a flare gun and a revolver she borrowed from her daddy, one he was issued in the war. Her task was to fire a flare into Vinny's boat. Sebastian's idea, the flare should cause chaos on board and provide light on their targets. Second thoughts? Emily asked as Vinny's boat quietly drifted towards them. Hundreds of dem, he admitted, but we're here now. The rocks known as Seal Rocks loomed out of the darkness like sleeping giants, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of Atlantic storms. Dorman dropped anchor, cut the engine, and let the Rose drift into and wait in the lee of the largest outcropping, using a hand signal to direct Sebastian and Edward to get in position. In the sudden quiet, every sound seemed amplified. The lap of waves against granite, the creak of the boat's fittings, his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, Romano was approaching with murder in mind. Dorman checked his father's rifle one final time, then settled into position behind the wheelhouse. Beside him, Emily crouched and peered through binoculars, scanning for approaching boats. A boat coming? No lights, she whispered. Coming from the southeast. This was it. No more planning, no more second-guessing. Tonight they would learn what they were truly capable of when everything they cared about hung in the balance. They watched the soundless vessel drift toward them like a ghost, cutting through the darkness with steady purpose. Vinny Romano's boat, exactly as Sebastian had described it. A sleek cabin cruiser, probably 40 feet, built for speed rather than the honest work of fishing. They're slowing down, Emily whispered, her binoculars trained on the approaching vessel. Dorman could see it now without magnification. A white hull that gleamed even in the faint starlight, coming to rest about 50 yards from the rocks. The sound of the anchor rigging dropping. Close enough for conversation, far enough to run if things went sideways. Romano was no fool. A spotlight suddenly blazed to life from the cruiser, sweeping across the water before settling on the briny Rose. Dorman squinted against the glare, raising one hand to shield his eyes while keeping the other near his rifle. Dorman Keating! The voice carried easily across the water, accented with the flat tones of Boston or New York. Come out where I can see you. Dorman stood slowly, making himself visible in the spotlight's beam, His father's rifle remained hidden behind the wheelhouse combing, within easy reach but invisible to the enemy. "I'm here," he called back, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You Romano?" A figure appeared at the cruiser's bow. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like an expensive overcoat despite the mild spring evening. Even at this distance, Dorman could sense the man's confidence, the way he carried himself like someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Vincent Romano," the voice confirmed, "though most people call me Vinny." He chuckled. "So it's true you are just a kid." "Old enough to run me own operation," Dorman replied, surprising himself at how comfortable he was in the situation. Romano laughed, a sound without warmth. "Your operation? Kid, you're playing with toys in a man's game. You think selling a few tins of rum makes you a smuggler?" The mockery stung, but Dorman held his position. Somewhere in the rocks behind him, Sebastian and Edward waited with their rifles trained on the cruiser. Emily crouched beside him, her father's service revolver heavy in her coat pocket and the flare gun in her hands. "I'm doing well enough," Dorman replied. "Better than you expected, or you wouldn't be here." "True enough." Vinny moved closer to the bow, and Dorman caught a glimpse of other figures behind him. 2, maybe 3, or more men, probably armed. "But here's the thing about playing man's games, kid. Sometimes you get hurt, sometimes people you care about get hurt." The threat was unmistakable. Dorman thought of Edward's bruised face, of his father rotting in Dorchester prison, of Uncle Danny bleeding out in the rain at McAllister's stage. "My uncle wasn't playing games," Dorman said, "and you killed him anyway." "Your uncle was interfering with my business interests, just like you're doing now." Vinny's voice hardened. "Enough with the small talk. I'm offering you a choice, Keating. Walk away, give me whatever inventory you've got left and get out of the trade, or end up like your uncle." The spotlight shifted slightly and Dorman caught a clearer view of Romano's face. Sharp features, cold eyes, a thin smile that held no humor. This was a man who had killed before and would kill again without losing sleep. "What about me, friend?" "Me crew," Dorman asked. "You and the girl can walk away. Clean break, no hard feelings. For anyone working for you." Vinny spread his hands in a gesture of false generosity. "I'm not unreasonable, kid. I'm practical." Behind the cruiser's wheelhouse, one of Romano's men was moving toward what looked like a mounted weapon. A machine gun, maybe, or something equally devastating. Dorman's blood chilled as he realized how quickly this could turn into a slaughter. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll have learned nothing from your uncle." The machine gun was definitely being positioned now, its barrel swinging toward the briny rose. In moments, Romano would have overwhelming firepower trained on them. The plan was falling apart before it had truly begun. Emily shifted beside him, her hands grasping the flare gun. She kept low, hidden from the spotlight, but ready. "Time's up, kid," Romano called. "What's it going to be?" Dorman's mind raced through thoughts, yet his demeanor remained ice-cold calm. He was bathing in that familiar sweet spot of danger, fear, and adrenaline he was so addicted to. Sebastian and Edward were in position, but the machine gun changed things. Even if they took down Vinny, his men could cut them to pieces before they could find cover. Then they all heard it, a low rumble at first, of another engine, coming directly from the direction of Burgeo. Not Sebastian's boat, which was already hidden among the rocks, but something else, something bigger. Vinny heard it too. His head turned toward the sound, and the spotlight swiveled to scan the water in that direction, leaving the briny rose in darkness. "Expecting company?" Vinny's voice had lost some of its casual confidence. The engine grew louder, and Dorman caught a glimpse of running lights approaching extremely fast. The distinctive pattern of an RCMP patrol boat, it was coming full throttle. Constable Griggs responding to whatever reports had reached him from the village. Romano cursed, a string of profanity that carried clearly across the water. The machine gun swung away from the rose toward the approaching patrol boat. "This isn't over, Keating," Vinny shouted. "You think the Mounties can protect you? Think again." The cruiser's engines roared to life, and Romano's boat began turning away from the rocks. But instead of fleeing immediately, the machine gun opened fire, not at the briny Rose, but at the approaching RCMP vessel. Tracers lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies. The patrol boat's searchlight exploded in a shower of sparks, and Dorman heard shouting from across the water. Griggs and his men were taking cover, returning fire with their service weapons. "Now!" Emily hissed. She jumped up, steadied herself, and took a second to aim the flare gun at the cruiser. She fired, and everyone watched in awe as the flaming projectile went straight into the window of the vessel. The cabin glowed a great bright white at first, then turned orange. Dorman grabbed his father's rifle, brought it to his shoulder, and took aim at Romano's boat. The glow from the flare gave them enough light to find targets. Dark silhouettes of men. The range wasn't long for the old 303. He found target, drew a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and he saw one of the dark figures stagger. At the same moment, Sebastian's rifle cracked from the rocks, followed by Edward's. In the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Romano's cruiser was finally turning to flee, but not before the machine gun swung back toward the briny Rose one final time. The machine gun's muzzle flash erupted like lightning across the dark water, and Dorman threw himself sideways, pulling Emily down with him as bullets shredded the air where they'd been standing. The briny Rose's wheelhouse exploded in a shower of splinters and glass, the wheel spinning free as rounds punched through the wooden planking. Emily screamed underneath Dorman as he laid on top of her. The gunfire lasted only seconds. When the hammering stopped, Dorman's ears rang with a high whine that made everything else sound muffled and distant. He raised his head cautiously, peering over the splintered gunwale. Romano's cruiser was pulling away fast, its engines at full throttle. The orange glow was gone, but smoke was billowing out of it. The RCMP patrol boat was listing slightly, smoke rising from it too, but it was still moving, still in pursuit. Griggs and his men were shouting something, but Dorman couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears. "You hit?" Emily asked, her voice tight with fear. Dorman took quick inventory. Arms, legs, everything seemed intact. "No, I'm good. How about you?" "I'm all right." She sat up slowly, glass falling from her hair. "Sweet Jesus, look at this boat." The briny Rose looked like she'd been through both world wars. The wheelhouse was riddled with holes. The compass was shattered, the new radio hanging by twisted wires. But miraculously, the hull seemed intact. The old girl was tougher than she looked. Sebastian and Edward pulled alongside quickly in Sebastian's boat. "You two okay?" Sebastian asked. "That was close," Dorman said. "They had enough firepower to sink a destroyer." Edward leaped onto the briny Rose. "Did we get any of them?" he asked. Sebastian nodded grimly. "Two down for certain. Vinny was hit, I think. Don't know how bad." The sounds of approaching engines made them all tense, but these were coming from Burgeo, smaller boats moving cautiously. Word of the gun battle had reached the village. "We needs to get out of here. Let's keep our lights off," Dorman said, moving to check the engine. "Before dose Mounties come back with questions we can't answer." The engine turned over on the third try, coughing blue smoke but running. Whatever damage the machine gun had done, it hadn't reached the motor. The briny Rose might look like a wreck, but she could still move. "What about the patrol boat?" Emily asked, watching the distant chase. Romano's cruiser was pulling away steadily, its superior speed giving it the advantage. "Griggs is his hands full," Sebastian said. "That machine gun put a lot of holes in his boat. He won't be chasing for long tonight." Dorman eased the Rose forward, steering carefully through the rocks. The compass was gone, but he knew these waters by feel. Behind them, the first of the Burgeo boats could be seen heading towards Seal Rocks. Billy Spencer's little boat, followed by two others. "Let them wonder," Emily said, reading his thoughts. "By morning, the story will be that Romano's gang attacked the RCMP. No one will mention us." It was true. Burgeo protected its own, even when, especially when, their own were bending the law. The village had closed ranks around smugglers before, and it would again. They made the harbor in an hour, moving slowly to avoid drawing attention. But the damage to the rows couldn't be hidden. Even in the darkness, the bullet holes were visible as darker patches against the wheelhouse. "We'll have to fix this before anyone official sees it," Dorman said, tying up at his usual berth. "I knows a feller in Ramea who can help," Sebastian offered. "Gets boat parts, no questions asked. But Dorman, you might be safe for now, but you won't be for too long." Dorman looked at him sharply. "Safe from what?" "Vinny's not the type to forgive or forget. If he survives tonight, well, this is just the opening move." Sebastian's expression was grim. "Now dat blood's been spilled. This won't end until one side or the other is finished. He'll be coming for both of us, Dorm." This wasn't just about smuggling anymore. Romano and his thugs would come for him now. It was personal. Anyone close to him would be in danger with this kind of enemy. Emily, Edward, even his mother, they'd all become targets. "Maybe I should take his offer," Dorman said quietly. "Get out of the trade. Keep everyone safe." "Too late for dat now, me son," Edward said, touching his bandaged forehead. "After what we done tonight, he won't be satisfied with just driving us out. He'll want blood." Emily nodded agreement. "Edward's right. Romano can't let this stand. It would make him look weak." "Let's hope he doesn't make it," Sebastian said. They helped unload what salvageable gear they could carry, working quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. The village was stirring, lights appearing in windows, voices carrying on the wind. News traveled fast in Burgeo. "What do we tell people about the boat?" Emily asked as they prepared to leave the harbor. "Engine trouble," Dorman said automatically. "Storm damage. Something Dad explains the mess without mentioning gunfights. And if Constable Griggs comes asking questions? We went out to check the lobster traps. Heard shooting into distance. Came home quick." The lie came easily. Too easily, Dorman thought. When had deception become so natural? They parted ways at the end of the wharf. Sebastian melted into the shadows like he'd never been there. Edward headed home, promising to spread the cover story. Emily walked with Dorman toward his house, neither speaking until they were well away from the harbor. "You did good tonight," she said finally. "Your da would be proud." Would he, really? Dorman wasn't so sure. Jack Keating had smuggled rum to feed his family, but he'd never killed anyone. Tonight, Dorman had pointed a rifle at another human being and pulled the trigger. The fact that he couldn't be sure he'd hit anyone didn't change the intent. "They started this," Emily reminded him. "With your uncle? With Edward's beaten. You're just finishing it." Maybe. But as they approached the Keating house, Dorman couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. The boy who'd gone out to check lobster traps was gone. In his place was someone harder, more dangerous. Someone who could look down a rifle barrel and squeeze the trigger without hesitation. Light showed in the kitchen window. His mother was awake, waiting. "What will you tell her?" Emily asked. "Da truth, mostly. She has a right to know what we're facing." Emily squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this, Darm. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together and we'll figure it out." He wanted to believe her. He watched Sebastian's boat disappear into the pre-dawn gloom, heading back toward the French islands and whatever sanctuary they offered. Dorman wondered if they'd already gone too far. The machine gun's roar still echoed in his memory. The feeling of the rifle's recoil against his shoulder. The moment when he'd chosen to shoot at another man rather than run away. There would be no running now. Romano had made that impossible. The only way forward was through whatever storm was coming, and Dorman prayed they'd all still be standing when it passed. He kissed Emily goodnight at the gate, her lips warm against his despite the chill in the air. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." Dorman watched her disappear into the darkness before turning toward his own home. As he walked the familiar path, he felt the weight of his father's rifle in his hands, the same hand that had once only known how to mend nets and bait hooks. Those hands had pulled a trigger tonight, had maybe taken a life. 8 months ago, he'd been a frightened boy standing over a hidden compartment, wondering how he'd feed his family through winter. Now he was the head of a smuggling operation, with partners who looked to him for leadership and enemies who wanted him dead. Somewhere along the way, the line between survival and something darker had blurred. I did what I had to, Da, he whispered to the night air, hoping somehow Jack could hear him across the miles of ocean and prison walls. And I'll keep doing what I must. The first light of dawn was touching the horizon as he reached the door, painting the sky the color of blood. Behind him lay boyhood, ahead the uncertain future of the man he was becoming. There would be no going back now. Margaret was waiting in the kitchen, her face lined with worry, but her eyes steady, worry written all over her face. Dorman leaned the Lee Enfield rifle in the corner of the kitchen. "Tell me," was all she said, and Dorman did. He sat down at the kitchen table and told his mom the whole story. After telling Margaret everything, the gunfight, Romano, the bullet-riddled briny Rose, Dorman braced for her fury. Instead, she sat quietly at the kitchen table, her weathered hands folded around a mug of cooling tea. "I should be shocked," she finally said, her voice steady, "but I think I've known for a while now that this was where we were headed." "You're not angry?" Dorman asked, confusion replacing the dread he'd been carrying. Margaret shook her head slowly. "I was married to your fatter for 20 years, Dorm. I knew what he was, what he became when he had to. And I knows what I am, a woman who chose to look the other way when the cupboards needed filling." She reached across the table to touch his hand. "I resigned myself long ago to the fact that I'd married a criminal. I just never thought I'd raise one too." Her words should have stung, but there was no judgment in them, only a tired acceptance that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. "But this Romano, this Vinnie Romano," Margaret continued, her grip tightening on his hand. "This is different, isn't it? This isn't about survival anymore." Dorman met her eyes, seeing his own reflection in them, older now than it had been just hours before. "No, Mom, this is about more than that now." The briny Rose was fixed within a day, a miracle of community effort that spoke to Burgeo's understanding of what needed to be done without questions asked. Edward and Billy brought planking from Romea, weathered boards that matched the Rose's hull so perfectly they might have been original. Sebastian sent replacement glass for the wheelhouse via a fishing boat from Francois, along with marine hardware that bore no identifying marks. Constable Griggs was absent during these repairs, his attention consumed by reports of the high-speed vessel outrunning and outgunning patrol boats all along the south coast. The description matched Romano's cruiser perfectly, but by the time authorities coordinated a response, the boat vanished like mist. The RCMP patrol boat limped back to Porto Basque with 3 wounded officers and a hole-riddled superstructure, testimony to the machine gun that had nearly sunk them. "Griggs is under pressure from his superiors," Billy Spencer reported during one of their careful conversations at the tavern. "They wants answers about who attacked an RCMP vessel with military-grade weapons. He's got no time to worry about local smugglers right now." It was a reprieve, but Dorman knew it wouldn't last. Perhaps eventually the investigation would circle back to Burgeo and the teenagers who'd been fishing near the Seal Rocks on the night in question. At Lawrence Kearley's funeral, Edward stood stoic and dry-eyed beside the grave. The cancer had finally claimed Lawrence in early July, but not before the expensive treatments bought with smuggling money had given his father 3 precious months, enough time to see his son become a man, to spend a little more time with his baby girl, enough time to say proper goodbyes, enough time to die with dignity rather than agony. When the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the cold rocky soil, Dorman placed a hand on Big Eddie's shoulder. "You gave him time," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he refused to let show. "Time, and that's worth more than anything." Janice Kearley approached them after the service, little Jessie clinging to her black dress. Her face was gaunt with grief, but her eyes held gratitude when she looked at Dorman. "Lawrence told me what you did for us," she whispered, taking his hand in both of hers. "The medicine, the treatments. We never could have afforded those things without your help." Dorman felt heat rise in his cheeks. "We're neighbors, Mrs. Kearley. Neighbors look after each other. Dare's neighbors, and den Dare's family, she said firmly. Your family now, Dorman Keating. Don't you forget dat. As the mourners dispersed into the gray July afternoon, Dorman caught sight of his mother watching from across the cemetery. Margaret's expression was unreadable, but when their eyes met, she nodded once. Understanding, acceptance, and perhaps was that a whisper of pride in what her son had become. By mid-July, they were back on the water, fishing by day, running goods by night. Their network had grown tighter, more disciplined, shaped by the knowledge that Romano's people could strike without warning. Emily's bookkeeping became meticulous to the point of obsession, every transaction recorded in code, every contact verified through multiple sources. Lucy's intelligence gathering proved invaluable. The girl had an uncanny ability to extract information from customers at her father's store, without them realizing they'd been questioned. Billy Spencer handled distribution with a professional's touch that impressed even Sebastian. The tavern keeper had connections throughout the coastal communities, built up over years of his family serving traveling fishermen and merchants. More importantly, he understood the delicate balance between profit and discretion that kept small operations alive. Romano's licking his wounds for now, Sebastian reported during a midnight meeting at the sandbanks. My contacts in Halifax say he lost 2 men that night at Seal Rocks. The men he lost were the kind of men who aren't easily replaced. Vinny himself was shot up, either by us or the Mounties. He'll be back, Dorman said. It wasn't a question, but a certainty that had settled into his bones. Eventually, but smarter next time, more careful. Sebastian's scarred face was grim in the lamplight. And more ruthless. What happened to your friend Edward will look like a love tap compared to what he's planning now. Emily leaned forward, her notebook balanced on her knees. Then we need to be ready. Anticipate his moves instead of just reacting to them. Standing at the helm of the Briny Rose one late October evening, watching sunset paint the harbor gold, Dorman found himself taking inventory of how far they'd all come. 11 months ago, he'd been a boy with a sick mother and an empty coal bin, terrified of the hidden compartment beneath his feet. Now he commanded respect from men 2 and 3 times his age, moved merchandise worth thousands of dollars, and recently moved on to making decisions that determined whether people lived or died. The transformation should have frightened him more than it did. Instead, it felt natural. Was this how Uncle Danny had felt? This intoxicating sense of control over circumstances that had once seemed hopeless? Was this what power really was like? Dorman wasn't sure what it was, but he would savor in it as long as he could. He thought about Emily, how her quick mind had saved them repeatedly, how her courage never wavered even in the face of armed mobsters. The memory of her kiss still lingered like warmth on a cold morning, a bright spot amid the darkness. Sometimes he couldn't stop thinking about the kiss, or her for that matter. Whatever they were becoming together, it was something neither could have imagined a year ago. The doctor's daughter and the smuggler's son, bound by shared secrets and by love. You look thoughtful, Emily said, climbing up from the cabin where she'd been updating her records. Just thinking about how much has changed, Dorman replied, not turning from the wheel. Last year at this time, me biggest worry was whether we'd have enough coal for winter. And now, asked Emily, now I'm wondering if we'll all be alive come Christmas. He chuckled. Emily moved to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. We will be, all of us, because we're smarter than Romano tinks, and because we're fighting for something he can never understand. What's that? Our home, she said simply. Everyone else in this business, Romano, even Sebastian, they're just trying to make money. But we're protecting our families, our community, our whole way of life. That makes us dangerous in ways they might overlook. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, official Dorchester Penitentiary stationery, but not in his father's familiar handwriting. Dorman's hands shook as he opened it, memories of the last such correspondence flooding back. Dear Mrs. Keating, I regret to inform you that your husband, Jack Keating, was involved in an altercation with another inmate on November 3rd. He sustained injuries requiring medical attention, but is now in stable condition in our infirmary. Mr. Keating asks that I assure you he is recovering well and that you should not worry unduly. Visitation remains suspended until his condition improves. Respectfully, Warden Thomas McIntyre. Margaret read it over his shoulder, her face paling as the implication sank in. Your fatter never was one to back down from a fight, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He's probably protecting someone, Dorman said, folding the letter carefully. You know the way he always did. But privately, he wondered if his father's troubles weren't connected to his own activities. Prison had its own networks of information, and no doubt Jack Keating's name or his Uncle Danny's name would be known to anyone with connections to the smuggling trade. Had Vinnie Romano's reach extended even there? Into a federal prison in New Brunswick? This was a scary thought. He would need to talk with Sebastian about this. And maybe it was time to make a trip to New Brunswick. He could certainly afford it now. Dorman tucked the letter into his pocket beside Uncle Danny's penknife. The weight of both items sat heavy against his heart, reminders of what he'd lost and what he was fighting for. Out in the harbor, the briny Rose waited at her mooring, patched but proud. Her new planking gleamed against the weathered hull, testament to the skills of men and women of Burgeo. Beyond the briny Rose, the open Atlantic stretched toward invisible horizons, toward St. Pierre, toward Halifax, toward Boston, toward whatever confrontation was building in the darkness. For now the waters were calm, the business was good, and his family was safe. Margaret's illness almost completely gone, her vigor nearly restored to what it once was. Edward had grown into his role as lieutenant, his loyalty absolute and his judgment sound. Emily had become something between partner and general, her strategic mind keeping them 3 steps ahead of their enemies. But in the quiet moments before sleep, Dorman could still hear the machine guns roar, echoing across dark water. Could still feel the rifle's recoil against his shoulder. The boy who once feared the winter cold was gone, replaced by a young man who understood that some fights couldn't be avoided. Vinnie Romano would return eventually. That was as certain as the tide. When he did, he would find not the frightened teenager he expected, but someone who had learned to embrace the darkness necessary for survival. Dorman fingered Uncle Danny's penknife in his pocket. Whatever came next, he would face it as a Keating, with cunning and determination. The machine gun had started this war, but it wouldn't end it. That would require something Romano hadn't counted on. A boy who had transformed into a ruthless gangster, who enjoyed the danger like a drug. Outside his window, fog was rolling in from the Atlantic, shrouding Burgeo in the gray mist that had hidden smugglers and saints alike for generations uncounted. Somewhere in that fog, Romano's people might be planning their next move, but they would find that the boy they'd tried to intimidate no longer existed. In his place stood a 15-year-old Dorman Keating, smuggler, protector, and heir to the now legendary Briny Rose. Dorman Keating and the Briny Rose were ready for whatever came next. The end.